Carl Jung explained, 14 spiritual patterns that appear when you're becoming emotionally untouchable. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the very ground beneath our emotional feet begins to shift, when the familiar territories of reactive engagement suddenly feel foreign, unstable, dangerous to traverse, like a ship's captain who has weathered countless storms only to recognize that the next tempest will either destroy the vessel entirely or demand a fundamental change in navigation. The psyche reaches a threshold where withdrawal becomes not retreat, but wisdom. This is not the withdrawal of the wounded animal, cowering in its cave, licking fresh wounds while the world continues its assault outside. No, this is something far more profound, far more intentional. This is the withdrawals of the master architect, who stands back from the blueprint, who recognizes that the foundation upon which everything has been built is cracked, that the very materials of construction have been corrupted by forces that no longer serve the greater design of becoming, the emotional chaos that once felt like the very essence of living, the drama, the intensity, the constant fluctuation between ecstasy and despair, begins to reveal itself as a kind of fever, a systemic infection that has convinced us that its symptoms are synonymous with vitality itself. We have mistaken the thrashing of drowning for the vigorous strokes of swimming. We have confused the frantic energy of reactivity with the purposeful motion of conscious direction. Jung understood this moment as a crucial turning point in individuation, what he might have called the beginning of the ego's necessary death and the self's gradual emergence. The ego, that false sovereign that has ruled our emotional kingdom with the iron fist of reactivity, begins to sense its days are numbered. And like all dying tyrants, it does not go quietly. It will thrash and rage and attempt to convince us that withdrawal equals death, that stepping back from the emotional maelstrom means stepping back from life itself. But the deeper wisdom knows better. The self, that timeless architect of our authentic becoming, recognizes that certain battles must be abandoned, not because they cannot be won, but because winning them would constitute the ultimate defeat. There are emotional territories where victory means the victory of everything we are trying to transcend. There are dramas where participation, regardless of how skillful, means remaining forever trapped within the very patterns we are meant to outgrow. The great withdrawal begins subtly, like the first whisper of autumn in late summer's heat. We notice ourselves pausing before responding to provocations that once triggered immediate engagement, where we once dove headfirst into every emotional storm, convinced that our involvement was not only necessary but noble. We find ourselves hesitating at the shoreline, watching the waves crash with a new kind of detachment. This detachment is not indifference, it is discernment. It is the soul's recognition that not every invitation to chaos deserves an RSVP. We begin to see the patterns with startling clarity, as if stepping back from a painting we had been examining with our nose pressed against the canvas. The individual brushstrokes that once seemed so urgent, so demanding of our attention, reveal themselves as part of larger compositions that repeat endlessly, mechanically, without growth or evolution. We see how others remain locked in these cycles, how they cast us in roles within their unconscious dramas, how they project upon us the very shadows they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. The recognition dawns like a cold sunrise over familiar landscape, now seen from an unfamiliar height. We have been participating in other people's unconscious patterns at the expense of our own conscious development. We have been feeding systems that devour authentic growth, that transform every genuine impulse toward transcendence into raw material for more of the same emotional recycling. This seeing creates what Jung would call a numinous moment, an encounter with something sacred that forever alters the landscape of possibility. We cannot unsee what has been seen. We cannot unknow what has been known. The very foundations of our previous emotional architecture begin to crack and shift, not toward collapse, but toward renovation. The soul, that eternal architect, begins to draw new blueprints. The withdrawal is not immediate or total. Like the gradual retreat of glacial ice, it happens in phases, with advances and retreats, with moments of old pattern reassertion and new pattern establishment. We might find ourselves stepping back from certain conversations, certain relationships, certain ways of being in the world that once felt not only normal but necessary. What others interpret as coldness or indifference, we begin to recognize as the essential boundary setting that allows genuine warmth to exist. There is a profound loneliness in this phase, a kind of existential solitude that comes with no longer fitting comfortably into the emotional ecosystems we once inhabited with such unconscious ease. We are like actors who have suddenly become aware that we are in a play, who can no longer deliver our lines with the same unconscious conviction, who see the sets and costumes and other actors with new eyes that make returning to old roles nearly impossible. Yet this loneliness is not the loneliness of abandonment. It is the loneliness of emergence. It is the cocoon-bound butterfly who no longer fits the caterpillar's world, but has not yet discovered its wings. It is the necessary solitude of gestation, of transformation, of something new taking shape in the secret chambers of becoming. The ego experiences this withdrawal as a kind of death, and in many ways it is. The part of us that derived identity from our emotional involvement in others' chaos, that felt useful and needed and alive precisely because we were always available for every crisis, every drama, every opportunity to rescue or fix or manage other people's inner landscapes. This part begins its necessary dissolution, and dissolution, even when it serves our deepest good, feels like dying. We may find ourselves mourning not just the relationships that no longer fit, but the very person we used to be within those relationships. The version of ourselves that could spend hours analyzing someone else's problems, that could absorb their emotional states like a sponge, that could make their healing our mission and their chaos our cocaine. This version begins to fade like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. But what emerges in the spaces left by this dissolution is something far more authentic, far more sustainable. Where once there was the anxious energy of constant emotional availability, there begins to grow the calm presence of conscious choice. Where once there was the frantic motion of reactive engagement, there develops the still point from which truly effective action can emerge. The great withdrawal teaches us to distinguish between the love that serves and the love that enables, between the compassion that heals and the compassion that perpetuates woundedness. We learn that there are forms of caring that are actually sophisticated forms of control, ways of giving that are actually subtle forms of taking, modes of helping that actually prevent the very growth we claim to support. This discernment is perhaps the most difficult wisdom to integrate because it requires us to acknowledge the shadow aspects of our most cherished self-concepts. The helper, the healer, the one who is always there for others. These identities, however noble they appear on the surface, often contain hidden agreements with unconsciousness, unspoken contracts that keep both ourselves and others trapped in patterns of dependency and stagnation. Jung's concept of Enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite, becomes vivid during this phase. Our greatest strengths reveal themselves as our most sophisticated weaknesses. Our most generous impulses show their tyrannical underbellies. Our deepest caring exposes its possessive roots. This is not cause for despair, but for celebration. It means the unconscious is becoming conscious. The shadow is stepping into light. The hidden is revealing itself for integration. The withdrawal from emotional chaos is ultimately a withdrawal from unconsciousness itself. Every time we step back from reactive engagement, we are choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, presence over absence, response over reaction. We are training ourselves to inhabit that sacred space between stimulus and response where true freedom lives. This training is not easy. The gravitational pull of old patterns is enormous. Others in our lives who have grown accustomed to our constant emotional availability will not celebrate our new boundaries. They may interpret our withdrawal as rejection, our healthy detachment as cruel indifference, our conscious choice as heartless abandonment. They will unconsciously attempt to draw us back into the familiar dances, the well-worn grooves of codependent engagement. Here we encounter what might be called the crucifixion of the helper, the moment when our refusal to participate in unconscious patterns is interpreted as a betrayal of love itself. We are accused of not caring, of being selfish, of abandoning others in their time of need. And part of us, the part that has been trained to equate love with self-abandonment, will wonder if these accusations contain truth. But the deeper wisdom holds steady. It recognizes that true love sometimes requires us to allow others to experience the natural consequences of their choices, to face their own shadows without our interference, to develop their own relationship with their inner resources rather than remaining dependent on our constant availability. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson of mature love, that caring sometimes means stepping back, that helping sometimes means refusing to help, that the greatest gift we can give others is our own conscious presence rather than our unconscious participation in their patterns of avoidance. The great withdrawal is thus revealed as a great arriving, an arrival into our own authentic relationship with compassion, with service, with love itself. We discover that we can care more deeply while caring less desperately, that we can serve more effectively while serving less compulsively, that we can love more powerfully while loving less possessively. This paradox becomes the foundation of a new way of being in the world, a way that Jung would recognize as movement toward the self rather than endless elaboration of ego patterns. We begin to operate from a center that is both deeply engaged with life and fundamentally unshakable by the chaos that surrounds us. We become like the mountain that provides shelter for countless travelers while never leaving its essential position, like the lighthouse that guides ships safely to harbor while remaining forever rooted in its own foundation. The emotional chaos that once seemed so compelling, so urgent, so deserving of our complete involvement begins to reveal itself as a kind of collective hypnosis, a shared agreement to remain unconscious, a conspiracy against the very growth and awakening that represent our deepest evolutionary possibility. Our withdrawal from this chaos is thus not a movement away from love, but toward it, not a retreat from service, but a preparation for more authentic forms of giving. We learn to trust the intelligence of natural boundaries, the wisdom of sustainable engagement, the necessity of protecting our own inner ecosystem so that it might serve not just our own development, but the development of all life. Like the gardener who knows that certain seasons require withdrawal from external activity so that deeper root systems can develop, we honor the necessity of this great retreat from emotional chaos. In the silence that follows our withdrawal, in the spaciousness that opens when we stop filling every gap with reactive energy, something new has room to emerge. The self, that deeper organizing principle that Jung recognized as our truest guide, begins to make itself known not through the drama of emotional engagement, but through the quiet authority of authentic presence. This is the beginning of emotional untouchability, not the untouchability of the defended heart, but the untouchability of the sovereign soul that knows its own worth, recognizes its own boundaries, and offers its gifts from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, choice rather than compulsion, consciousness rather than unconscious reaction. The great withdrawal from emotional chaos is thus revealed as the great arrival into emotional mastery, the first movement in a symphony of transformation that will ultimately reveal the possibility of living with an open heart that cannot be shattered, a caring presence that cannot be depleted, a love that serves life itself rather than the endless appetite of unconscious patterns. From this new vantage point, we begin to see others not as problems to be solved or wounds to be healed, but as sovereign beings on their own journeys of becoming. We offer our presence as a gift rather than imposing our help as a burden. We create space for others' growth rather than filling every gap with our own need to be needed. This is the sacred architecture that begins to emerge from the ashes of our old emotional engagement patterns, a structure built not on the unstable ground of reactive involvement, but on the bedrock of conscious choice, authentic presence, and the kind of love that serves life's deepest movement toward awakening and wholeness. In the aftermath of withdrawal, in the sacred emptiness left by our retreat from emotional chaos, a new form of caring begins to crystallize, one that would have seemed impossible from the vantage point of our previous understanding. Like the alchemist who discovers that the base metal of attached love can be transmuted into the gold of detached compassion, we find ourselves entering a laboratory of the heart where ancient paradoxes reveal their deepest secrets. This is not the compassion we have known before, that urgent, anxious caring that felt so much like love, but carried within it the seeds of possession, control, and eventual exhaustion. This new compassion emerges from a different source entirely, flowing not from the ego's need to be needed, but from the self's natural response to the suffering and beauty of existence itself. Jung understood this transformation as one of the most profound movements in the individuation process, the shift from ego-driven caring to self-sourced love. The ego cares because it gets something in return: validation, purpose, identity, the illusion of control over outcomes. The self loves because love is its nature, because compassion is not something it does, but something it is. This fundamental difference creates an entirely different quality of presence in the world. We begin to notice this shift in the most subtle ways at first. Where once our caring felt heavy, fraught with anxiety about outcomes and desperate attachment to others' healing, we find ourselves able to hold space for suffering without being consumed by it. Like the Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, aware of all the world's pain, yet unmoved from the center of perfect equanimity, we discover that true compassion requires a certain quality of detachment, not the detachment of indifference, but the detachment of unlimited capacity. The old model of caring operated on the principle of emotional merger. We absorbed others' pain as if it were our own, took on their problems as if solving them were our responsibility, merged so completely with their inner landscape that we lost track of where they ended and we began. This merger felt like love, looked like love, was praised by others as the highest form of caring. Yet beneath its noble appearance lay a sophisticated form of unconsciousness, a way of avoiding our own inner work by becoming perpetually absorbed in others. The alchemy begins when we recognize this merger as a form of spiritual materialism, using compassion itself as a drug to avoid the difficult work of facing our own shadows, our own wounds, our own need for healing and growth. We see how our identity as helpers and healers became a kind of prison, keeping us forever focused outward while the inner landscape remained largely unexplored and unintegrated. This recognition brings with it a particular kind of grief. not just grief for the relationships that can no longer sustain this dynamic, but grief for the version of ourselves that felt so useful, so needed, so essential to others' well-being. There is a death here, a genuine dissolution of identity structures that have served as the foundation of our self-concept for years, perhaps decades. The ego that derived its sense of worth from being indispensable to others must learn to find value in simply being, without the constant validation that comes from being needed. Yet in this death, something far more precious is born. As the anxious urgency of attached caring begins to dissolve, we discover that our capacity for genuine love actually expands. Like a river that has been dammed, finally flowing free, compassion begins to move through us with a naturalness and power that was impossible when we were trying to force it, manage it, direct it according to our ego's agenda. This is the great paradox that mystics and depth psychologists have recognized throughout the ages. We can only truly love others to the degree that we have learned to love ourselves. And we can only love ourselves to the degree that we have learned to step back from the compulsive need to fix, rescue, and control everyone around us. The two movements are inseparable aspects of the same fundamental transformation. Detached compassion reveals itself as love without agenda, caring without expectation, service without the need for gratitude or recognition. It flows from an inner fullness rather than an inner emptiness, offers itself as a gift rather than imposing itself as a burden. When we operate from this space, others can receive our love without feeling obligated to it, can accept our caring without becoming dependent upon it. The practical implications of this shift are profound. We find ourselves able to be present with others' pain without taking it on, to witness their struggles without immediately rushing to solutions, to offer support without becoming attached to whether that support is accepted or effective. Like a skilled physician who can remain calm and clear-headed while treating the most severe injuries, we develop the capacity to stay centered and resourceful in the face of others' chaos. This does not mean we become cold or indifferent. On the contrary, our caring often becomes more effective, precisely because it is no longer contaminated by our own emotional reactivity. When we are not anxiously attached to outcomes, we can see situations more clearly, respond more appropriately, offer exactly what is needed rather than what our ego thinks should be needed. The transformation is perhaps most visible in how we hold space for others' emotions. Previously, when someone we cared about was in pain, we would feel compelled to do something, fix something, change something about their situation. Their pain became our emergency, their healing our mission, their happiness our responsibility. This urgency, however loving it appeared, often prevented us from offering what they actually needed. Simple presence, unconditional acceptance, the experience of being witnessed without being judged or managed. Detached compassion teaches us the sacred art of not fixing. We learn to sit with others in their darkness without immediately reaching for the light switch, to accompany them in their confusion without rushing to provide clarity, to witness their struggles without automatically offering solutions. This requires tremendous faith, faith in their own inner wisdom, faith in life's inherent intelligence, faith in the healing power of authentic presence. Jung's concept of the wounded healer becomes particularly relevant here. We recognize that our own wounds, rather than being obstacles to our ability to serve others, are actually the source of our deepest compassion. But this recognition comes with a crucial insight. Our wounds serve others not when we bleed all over them in unconscious identification, but when we have done enough inner work that our scars can serve as evidence of healing's possibility rather than proof of pain's permanence. The alchemical transformation reveals that suffering, when consciously held and integrated, becomes the raw material of wisdom. Our own journey through darkness, our own encounters with shadow and limitation, our own experiences of loss and betrayal and disappointment, all of these become not burdens to be hidden, but gifts to be offered. Yet they can only be offered as gifts when we have stopped trying to use others' healing as proof of our own worthiness. This is perhaps the most subtle aspect of the alchemy, recognizing how much of our previous caring was actually a sophisticated attempt to heal ourselves vicariously through others. By fixing them, we hoped to prove that we ourselves were fixable. By rescuing them, we attempted to rescue the wounded parts of ourselves that we had not yet learned to face directly. By becoming essential to their healing, we tried to establish our own essential worth. Detached compassion requires us to withdraw this projection, to stop using others' growth as evidence of our own value, to develop a relationship with our own worth that is not dependent on external validation. This withdrawal can feel like a profound abandonment, not just of others, but of the very mechanisms through which we have sought to establish meaning and purpose in our lives. Yet what emerges on the other side of this dissolution is far more stable and sustainable. When our compassion no longer depends on others' receptivity, when our caring no longer requires validation, when our service no longer needs recognition, we discover a source of love that cannot be depleted, a wellspring of kindness that cannot be exhausted. The Buddha's teaching of compassionate detachment becomes lived reality rather than mere philosophy. We find ourselves able to love others completely while being completely unattached to their response to that love. We can offer our full presence while maintaining complete sovereignty over our inner state. We can care deeply while caring lightly, serve powerfully while serving without effort. This transformation affects every relationship in our lives. Some relationships built primarily on patterns of codependency and emotional enmeshment may not survive the transition. Others discover new depths and possibilities as they are freed from the subtle tyranny of attached caring. New relationships begin to form on entirely different foundations, not based on mutual need and emotional dependency, but on mutual recognition and authentic appreciation. We begin to attract people who are drawn to our presence rather than our function, who value our being rather than our doing, who appreciate our centered calm rather than our anxious availability. These relationships feel fundamentally different, lighter, more spacious, more genuinely nourishing for all involved. The alchemy also transforms our relationship with service itself. Where once we served from a sense of obligation, guilt, or the need to prove our worth, we now serve from natural overflow. Our giving becomes effortless because it flows from abundance rather than attempting to fill lack. Our help becomes truly helpful because it emerges from clarity rather than projection. We discover the profound truth that the Tao Te Ching articulates. The highest form of action is non-action. The most effective intervention is non-interference. By learning to step back and trust life's own healing intelligence, we often accomplish more than we ever did through forceful intervention. Our presence becomes our greatest gift, our being our most valuable contribution. This does not mean we become passive or disengaged. Rather, our engagement becomes more surgical, more precise, more attuned to what is actually needed rather than what our ego assumes should be needed. We learn to sense when action is called for and when restraint serves better. We develop the wisdom to know when our involvement will genuinely help and when it will actually hinder the natural processes of growth and healing. The detached compassion that emerges from this alchemical process carries within it all the warmth and tenderness of the heart, but none of the anxiety and attachment of the ego. It loves freely because it has nothing to prove. serves joyfully because it has nothing to gain, cares deeply because caring is its essential nature rather than its chosen strategy. In this space, we finally understand what the mystics meant when they spoke of unconditional love. It is not love despite conditions, but love that exists prior to and independent of any conditions. It does not need the beloved to be different than they are, does not require gratitude or reciprocity, does not demand outcomes or results. It simply is, like sunlight that shines equally on all things, like rain that falls without discrimination, like the earth that supports all life without asking for anything in return. This unconditional quality of detached compassion becomes a healing presence in the world. Others can feel the difference immediately. They sense that they are not being judged, managed, fixed, or changed. They experience, perhaps for the first time, the radical acceptance of being loved exactly as they are in this moment, without conditions or expectations. Paradoxically, this unconditional acceptance often creates more space for authentic growth and change than all our previous efforts at improvement and intervention. When people feel completely accepted, they no longer need to maintain defensive postures. When they are not being pushed to change, they often discover their own natural movement toward wholeness. The alchemy of detached compassion thus reveals itself as perhaps the most powerful force for healing available to human consciousness. It serves not by doing but by being, heals not through intervention but through presence, transforms not through effort but through the natural transmission of integrated wholeness. From this foundation of detached compassion, we begin to see that true service to others and authentic self-care are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of the same movement toward consciousness. We cannot truly serve others from an empty vessel, cannot genuinely love others without first establishing a loving relationship with ourselves, cannot offer what we do not possess. The great work of individuation reveals itself as both utterly personal and completely universal. By learning to love ourselves unconditionally, we develop the capacity to love others unconditionally. By establishing healthy boundaries with our own inner chaos, we create the stability needed to hold space for others' chaos without being destabilized by it. This is the alchemy that transforms base attachment into golden compassion, the recognition that love serves life best when it flows from fullness rather than emptiness, when it offers presence rather than presence, when it trusts the beloved's own capacity for healing rather than attempting to heal them from the outside. In this sacred laboratory of the heart, we discover that the greatest gift we can give others is our own wholeness. The deepest service we can offer is our own authenticity. The most profound healing we can provide is the living example of a human being who has learned to love without attachment, care without control, and serve without the need to be needed. In the depths of our psychological underworld, where the rejected aspects of ourselves dwell in exile, there lives a figure we have been taught to fear above all others, the one who puts their own needs first, who says no without elaborate justification, who protects their energy as fiercely as a mother protects her young. This figure, banished to the shadows by years of conditioning about what it means to be good, loving, and worthy of acceptance, holds within its dark embrace one of the most essential keys to our liberation. The integration of healthy selfishness represents perhaps the most challenging aspect of individuation for those of us who have built our identities around being givers, helpers, and perpetual sources of support for others. It requires us to face the terrible truth that much of what we have called love has actually been a sophisticated form of self-abandonment, a way of earning worth through the abdication of our own sovereignty. Jung understood the shadow not as something evil to be eliminated, but as the repository of our unlived life, the container of all the qualities we have rejected in our quest to become acceptable to others. In the case of the chronic giver, the chronic helper, the one who has learned to equate their value with their availability, the shadow contains all the natural impulses toward self-protection, self-advocacy, and self-prioritization that healthy psychological development requires. This shadow aspect appears first as a whisper of rebellion, a quiet voice that begins to question the sustainability of endless giving. It asks dangerous questions. What about my needs? What about my dreams? What about my energy, my time, my life force that has been flowing outward like a river with no banks, nourishing everyone's garden but my own? These questions feel selfish because we have been programmed to experience any attention to our own inner landscape as a betrayal of our role as servants to others' well-being. The cultural conditioning runs so deep that the very word selfish carries within it the weight of ultimate condemnation. To be called selfish is to be cast out from the community of the good, to be labeled as someone who has chosen their own interests over the greater good. Yet beneath this conditioning lies a profound misunderstanding of what the self actually is and what it means to serve its authentic needs. The false self we have constructed, the one that gains identity through endless availability, that feels worthy only when needed, that equates love with self-sacrifice. This false self is indeed selfish in the most destructive sense. It uses others as sources of validation, makes their healing its mission to avoid facing its own wounds, creates dependency to ensure its own importance. This is the selfishness of the ego, which takes even in its giving, which serves itself even through its apparent service to others. But there is another kind of selfishness entirely, the selfishness of the authentic self, which Jung recognized as the true center of psychological wholeness. This self knows that it cannot give what it does not have, cannot serve from emptiness, cannot love others authentically without first establishing a genuine relationship with its own depths. This self understands that true service to life requires the kind of self-care that maintains its capacity to serve, the kind of boundaries that preserve its integrity, the kind of discrimination that directs its energy toward what truly matters. The shadow integration begins when we stop running from this healthy selfishness and begin to explore what it has to teach us. Like a feared teacher who turns out to hold the very wisdom we have been seeking, this rejected aspect of ourselves begins to reveal its gifts. It shows us where we have been leaking energy, where we have been saying yes when we meant no, where we have been available for others' dramas while remaining unavailable for our own growth. This exploration is not comfortable. It requires us to examine the unconscious contracts we have made, agreeing to be endlessly available in exchange for love, acceptance, and identity. It asks us to look honestly at how much of our giving has been motivated not by genuine love, but by the terror of being rejected, abandoned, or seen as inadequate. It forces us to confront the ways we have used our helpfulness as a form of control, making ourselves indispensable to avoid facing our own feelings of dispensability. The integration process often begins with small acts of rebellion. We find ourselves saying no to requests that we would have automatically accepted. We discover ourselves prioritizing our own rest over someone else's crisis. We catch ourselves feeling resentful about giving, and instead of immediately suppressing this resentment as evidence of our inadequacy, we begin to listen to it as information about our own unmet needs and overextended boundaries. This phase can feel deeply uncomfortable, even shameful. The ego that has built its identity around being selfless experiences these moments of self-prioritization as evidence of its failure, its corruption, its transformation into the very thing it has always condemned. But the deeper wisdom recognizes these moments as evidence of healing, as signs that the natural self-preservation instincts that healthy individuation requires are finally beginning to function. Jung's concept of Enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological energy to transform into its opposite, becomes vivid during this integration. Our greatest strength reveals its shadow side. The chronic giver discovers their inner tyrant. The eternal helper encounters their hidden manipulator. The selfless servant meets their resentful victim. This is not cause for despair, but for celebration. It means the unconscious is becoming conscious. The split is beginning to heal. The rejected aspects of self are returning home. The integration of healthy selfishness requires us to develop what might be called the courage of imperfection. We must be willing to disappoint others, to be seen as less giving, less available, less willing to sacrifice ourselves for their comfort. We must risk being misunderstood, criticized, even rejected by those who have grown comfortable with our endless availability and are threatened by our newfound boundaries. This courage is perhaps most tested in our closest relationships, where the patterns of giving and receiving have become so entrenched that any change feels like betrayal. Partners who have grown accustomed to our constant accommodation may interpret our new self-advocacy as selfishness. Friends who have relied on our endless emotional availability may experience our boundaries as rejection. Family members who have counted on our automatic yes may respond to our thoughtful no with guilt, anger, or manipulation. Here we encounter what might be called the crucifixion of the people-pleaser, the moment when our commitment to our own authenticity is met with the disapproval, disappointment, or even hostility of those we have trained to expect our self-abandonment. This is often the most difficult part of the integration process because it forces us to choose between our own growth and others' comfort, between our authentic self and their version of who we should be. The shadow integration teaches us that true love sometimes requires us to risk being unloved. It shows us that authentic relationships can only exist between two whole people, not between a giver and a taker, not between a rescuer and a victim, not between someone who has sacrificed their self and someone who has learned to expect that sacrifice as the price of relationship. As we learn to honor our own needs without guilt, to protect our own energy without apology, to prioritize our own growth without shame, we discover something remarkable. Our capacity to give authentically actually increases. When we give from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than depletion, from love rather than fear, our gifts carry a different quality entirely. They are received differently because they are offered differently, as genuine expressions of care rather than desperate attempts to earn love. The healthy selfishness that emerges from shadow integration is not the petty selfishness of the narcissistic ego, but the sacred selfishness of the individuating soul. It recognizes that we have not come into this life to be endlessly available to others' unconscious patterns, but to develop our own unique gifts, to fulfill our own particular purpose, to become the specific expression of consciousness that only we can embody. This recognition brings with it a profound shift in how we understand service itself. We begin to see that the highest service we can offer the world is not the sacrifice of our authentic self, but its full development and expression. We recognize that by becoming who we truly are, with all our needs, boundaries, preferences, and authentic responses, we give others permission to do the same. The shadow integration reveals that what we have called selflessness has often been a sophisticated form of hiding, a way of avoiding the vulnerable work of being authentically ourselves in relationship with others. By constantly focusing on their needs, we never had to risk revealing our own. By making their healing our mission, we never had to face our own wounds. By being endlessly available for their growth, we could avoid the challenging work of our own development. True selfishness, in its healthiest form, is the willingness to be authentically ourselves, even when that authenticity disappoints others. It is the courage to have needs, to express preferences, to maintain boundaries, to say no when no serves life better than yes. It is the recognition that we cannot love others more than we love ourselves, without that love eventually becoming poisoned by resentment, depletion, and hidden expectation. The integration process teaches us to distinguish between the selfishness that serves life and the selfishness that diminishes it. The ego's selfishness is acquisitive, defensive, always trying to get something from others to fill its own sense of lack. The self's selfishness is generative, protective, always ensuring that its capacity to serve life is maintained and renewed. This distinction becomes crucial as we learn to navigate the complex territory between self-care and self-indulgence, between healthy boundaries and rigid walls, between authentic self-expression and narcissistic self-absorption. The shadow integration does not give us a license to become callous or indifferent to others' well-being, but it does give us permission to recognize that our own well-being is equally important, equally deserving of attention and protection. We learn that saying no to others' demands for our energy is actually saying yes to life's deeper request for our authentic participation. We discover that protecting ourselves from emotional vampires is not cruelty but compassion. Compassion for our own tender heart, compassion for our own finite resources, compassion for our own need to remain whole and available for what truly matters. The healthy selfishness that emerges from shadow integration teaches us the sacred art of energy management. We begin to recognize that our life force is not an infinite resource to be freely given to whoever asks, but a precious gift to be stewarded wisely. We learn to sense which interactions nourish us and which deplete us, which relationships support our growth and which keep us trapped in patterns of stagnation. This discernment is not always comfortable to exercise. It requires us to acknowledge that not all people are good for us, that not all causes deserve our energy, that not all requests for help serve the highest good. It asks us to develop what might be called compassionate discrimination, the ability to care about others' well-being while still protecting our own. The shadow integration reveals that much of what we have called compassion has actually been unconscious enabling. Much of what we have called love has been subtle codependency. Much of what we have called service has been sophisticated self-abandonment. This recognition can be devastating to our self-concept, but it is also liberating. It means we can stop trying to love in ways that don't actually serve love, stop helping in ways that don't actually help, stop giving in ways that don't actually give, ultimately diminish both giver and receiver. As the integration deepens, we begin to understand that healthy selfishness is actually a prerequisite for genuine altruism. We cannot truly put others' needs first if we don't have a clear sense of what our own needs are. We cannot make authentic choices about how to serve if we are operating from patterns of compulsion and unconscious reaction. We cannot offer ourselves as gifts if we have never taken the time to discover what those gifts actually are. The shadow integration teaches us that the self we have been taught to sacrifice is not our true enemy, but our truest ally. This self knows what we need to thrive, what we need to contribute, what we need to become. It holds the blueprint of our authentic development, the map of our genuine purpose, the keys to our real fulfillment. By learning to listen to this self, to honor its wisdom, to protect its integrity, we finally become able to serve life from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. This does not mean we become selfish in the petty, acquisitive sense. Rather, we become selfish in the most sacred sense, devoted to the full development and authentic expression of the unique consciousness that we are. We recognize that this consciousness did not come into being to be endlessly available to others' unconscious patterns, but to fulfill its own particular function in the larger symphony of existence. The integration of healthy selfishness ultimately reveals itself as an act of love, not just love for ourselves, but love for life itself. By refusing to sacrifice our authentic development on the altar of others' approval, we preserve something precious and irreplaceable. By learning to say no to what diminishes us, we say yes to what expands us. By honoring our own deepest needs, we develop the capacity to serve others' deepest needs rather than their surface demands. From this foundation of integrated selfishness, we begin to discover what Jung meant by the realization of the self, not the ego that seeks constant validation through self-sacrifice, but the deeper organizing principle that knows its own worth, recognizes its own purpose, and serves life through the full development and authentic expression of its unique gifts. This is the paradox that shadow integration reveals. We can only truly serve others by first learning to serve ourselves, can only genuinely love others by first establishing authentic self-love, can only effectively help others by first ensuring our own psychological and emotional health. The healthy selfishness that emerges from this integration is not the enemy of love, but its most essential foundation, not the opposite of service, but its most reliable source. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the most cherished mask must fall, when the golden halo we have worn so proudly becomes a crown of thorns, cutting deep into the very flesh of our false identity. This is the hour of the Savior's death, not the mythic Christ upon Golgotha, but the archetypal rescuer that has lived within our psyche, feeding on the sweet poison of others' need, growing stronger with each sacrifice we make upon the altar of their pain. For so long we have carried the cross of others' suffering, believing in the sacred lie that our worth is measured by how much we can absorb, how much we can heal, how much we can give until we are emptied of everything that once belonged to us. We have worn our wounds like stigmata, proof of our martyrdom, evidence of our holiness. But stigmata, Jung reminds us, are often the psyche's way of making visible what has remained unconscious, the ways we have crucified our authentic self in service to an image that was never truly ours to begin with. The savior complex is perhaps the most seductive of all psychological patterns, for it wraps itself in the garments of virtue, while concealing the shadow of our deepest wounds. It whispers that we are special, chosen, divinely appointed to heal what others cannot heal, to carry what others cannot bear. It feeds on the unconscious belief that love must be earned through suffering, that acceptance comes only through endless giving, that to exist without being needed is to exist without purpose at all. But beneath this golden persona lies a terrified child, one who learned early that love is conditional upon service, that safety comes only through being indispensable. This child discovered that their own pain was too threatening to the family system, too inconvenient to the narrative others needed them to play, and so they learned to disappear their own needs, to transform their anguish into a superpower of empathy, to become the vessel that could hold everyone else's emotional chaos while appearing serene and unbreakable. The death of this savior begins not with a dramatic moment of realization, but with a slow, creeping exhaustion that no amount of giving can cure. It begins when we notice that those we have rescued the most return again and again, not healed but hungry, not grateful but entitled, not transformed but dependent. It begins when we realize that our compulsive helping has become a prison where we are both the guard and the prisoner, keeping ourselves locked in patterns that drain our life force while preventing others from discovering their own capacity for healing. The crucifixion of the rescuer archetype is a death that must be chosen consciously, for it will not die naturally. It has too much invested in its own mythology, too much power derived from being needed. When we begin to withdraw our constant availability, when we stop rushing to fix every crisis, when we allow others to sit with their own discomfort without immediately relieving it, we will face accusations that feel like nails driven into our flesh. "You've changed," they will say, and in their voices, we will hear the betrayal of children whose parent has suddenly stopped playing the game that defined the relationship. "You're being selfish," they will cry, and we will feel the familiar pull to return to our post, to resume our vigil at the cross of their suffering. But this is the moment of choosing. Do we return to the familiar cage of our Savior identity, or do we allow this archetype to die so that something more authentic can be born? The dying Savior within us experiences a kind of ego crucifixion that mirrors the great mythic patterns Jung explored throughout his work. Like the hero who must descend into the underworld, like the god who must die to be reborn, the rescuer must release its grip on the very identity that once felt like our truest self. This death is not punishment but transformation, not ending but metamorphosis, yet it feels like betrayal because we have confused our worth with our usefulness, our identity with our function. In the mythology of Christianity, Christ's crucifixion is followed by the dark night of the tomb, that liminal space between death and resurrection, where the old form must completely dissolve before the new can emerge. For those releasing the Savior complex, this tomb time manifests as a profound disorientation. Who are we if we are not the helper? What is our value if we are not constantly giving? How do we relate to others without the familiar dynamic of rescuer and victim? This disorientation is not a sign that we are moving in the wrong direction. It is the natural consequence of any genuine individuation process. When we withdraw our energy from external fixing and turn it toward our own inner work, we discover landscapes within ourselves that have been neglected for years, perhaps decades. We find our own pain waiting patiently to be witnessed, our own dreams asking to be honored, our own voice longing to be heard above the cacophony of others' demands. The Savior's death reveals to us the shadow side of our helping, how much of it was driven by the need to avoid our own inner work, how much was motivated by the unconscious desire to maintain control, how much was fueled by the addiction to being seen as good, pure, selfless. We begin to see how our compulsive rescuing often robbed others of their own heroic journey, how our inability to witness suffering without fixing it prevented those around us from developing their own relationship with pain, their own capacity for resilience. Jung wrote extensively about the phenomenon of Enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when they reach an extreme. The Savior complex, when lived unconsciously and compulsively, eventually transforms into its shadow: resentment, burnout, manipulation disguised as care. We begin to give with strings attached, to help with expectations of gratitude, to sacrifice while keeping a secret ledger of what others owe us. The helper becomes the victim, and the victim becomes the persecutor in an unconscious dance that serves no one. The recognition of these shadow elements is part of the Savior's crucifixion process. We must face the uncomfortable truth that not all of our helping came from pure love, that much of it was contaminated by our own unmet needs, our own desperate attempts to feel valuable and necessary. This recognition brings with it a profound grief. Grief for the years spent living from a false center, grief for the relationships that were built on dysfunction rather than authentic connection, grief for the parts of ourselves that were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of our indispensability. But this grief, like all genuine mourning, carries within it the seeds of liberation. as we allow ourselves to feel the full weight of what we have lost. The familiar identity, the constant stream of validation, the sense of purpose that came through being needed. We create space for something new to emerge. The death of the Savior is not the end of our capacity to serve others. It is the beginning of service that comes from wholeness rather than woundedness, from choice rather than compulsion. The resurrection that follows this archetypal death is not a return to the old form, but a transformation into something that was always potential within us. The authentic self that can offer genuine help without losing itself in the process. This self knows the difference between healthy support and enabling, between compassion and codependence, between loving service and self-abandonment. It understands that the most profound gift we can offer others is not the elimination of their struggle, but the modeling of how to be whole while walking through difficulty. When the Savior complex dies, we discover that we can still be helpful without being compulsive about it. We can offer support without taking on others' emotional states as our own. We can witness pain without immediately rushing to fix it. We can love people while still maintaining the boundaries necessary for our own well-being. This is not selfishness, it is the mature recognition that we cannot give what we do not possess, cannot heal in others what remains wounded within ourselves. The death of our inner Savior also transforms our relationship with suffering itself. No longer do we see pain as something to be immediately eliminated or absorbed. Instead, we begin to understand suffering as one of the great teachers, as the force that compels growth and awakening. We learn that our attempts to shield others from their necessary struggles often prevented them from developing the very strength they needed to navigate life's challenges. This shift requires us to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without immediately resolving it, to sit with tension without rushing to action, to witness difficulty without becoming overwhelmed by it. The dying Savior learns that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to allow others to face their dragons alone, to trust in their capacity for growth, to offer presence rather than solutions. As this transformation deepens, we begin to recognize that our compulsive helping was often a way of avoiding our own inner work. By focusing intensely on others' problems, we could distract ourselves from the uncomfortable process of looking within, of facing our own shadows, of doing the difficult work of individuation. The Savior complex, in this sense, was both a gift and a curse. It gave us a sense of purpose while keeping us from discovering our true purpose. The community that formed around our Savior identity will resist this death with surprising intensity. Those who have become accustomed to our endless availability, our willingness to absorb their chaos, our function as the family or friend group's emotional dumping ground, will experience our transformation as abandonment. They will employ various strategies to pull us back into our old role: guilt, manipulation, crisis creation, threats of withdrawal. This resistance is not necessarily conscious or malicious. It arises from the natural tendency of systems to maintain homeostasis, to resist change, even when that change would ultimately be beneficial for everyone involved. Those who have become dependent on our compulsive giving have organized their own psyches around our availability. When we suddenly become unavailable in the old way, their system experiences this as a threat that must be neutralized. Understanding this dynamic can help us navigate the death of our Savior complex with greater compassion, both for ourselves and for those who resist our transformation. We can recognize their protests as evidence of how thoroughly we have trained them to depend on our dysfunction. We can see their discomfort as proof that real change is occurring, that we are no longer playing the old game that kept everyone stuck in familiar but limiting patterns. The process of allowing the Savior to die requires tremendous courage because it asks us to disappoint people we love, to let others experience the consequences of their choices, to appear selfish to those who have benefited from our self-abandonment. It requires us to trust that authentic love, love that includes appropriate boundaries and healthy limits, is ultimately more nourishing than the pseudo-love that comes through constant sacrifice. This transformation also demands that we develop a new relationship with our own worth. For so long, our value has been contingent upon our usefulness, our identity built upon being needed. As the Savior dies, we must learn to find worth in simply existing, value in being rather than doing, purpose in the cultivation of our own authentic nature rather than in the management of others' emotions. The death of the Savior complex reveals to us the difference between genuine service and compulsive helping. Genuine service arises from abundance, from a full cup that naturally overflows. It is offered without attachment to outcome, without need for recognition, without the expectation that those we serve will be grateful or changed by our efforts. Compulsive helping, by contrast, arises from emptiness, from the desperate hope that giving will somehow fill the void within us, that sacrifice will earn us the love we believe we cannot receive simply by being ourselves. As this distinction becomes clear, we begin to understand that the death of our inner Savior is not a loss of our capacity for compassion, but a purification of it. We learn to offer help when it is truly helpful, to say no when our assistance would prevent others from growing, to give from fullness rather than emptiness. We discover that we can love people deeply while still allowing them to walk their own path, to make their own mistakes, to find their own way to healing. The Savior's death also initiates us into a more mature understanding of human relationships. We begin to see that healthy connections are built on mutuality rather than dependency, on the capacity to both give and receive rather than on the compulsive need to be needed. We learn that true intimacy requires vulnerability from both parties, not just the willingness of one to carry the pain of the other. This realization can be particularly challenging for those whose identity was built around being strong for others, being the rock that never crumbles, being the lighthouse that guides others to safety while never needing guidance ourselves. The death of the Savior asks us to reveal our own humanity, to admit our own needs, to allow others to care for us in return. This vulnerability feels terrifying to the part of us that equated worth with invulnerability, but it is essential for authentic relationship. In Jungian terms, the death of the Savior complex represents a crucial stage in the individuation process, the gradual differentiation of the authentic self from the personas we have developed to navigate the world. The Savior persona, no matter how noble it appears, is still a mask that obscures our true nature. Its death allows us to discover who we are beneath the role, what remains when we are not defined by our function as rescuer, helper, fixer. This discovery is often surprising. We may find talents and interests that were suppressed in service to our helping identity. We may discover aspects of personality that were deemed incompatible with our Savior role. We may uncover dreams and desires that were sacrificed on the altar of others' needs. The death of the Savior creates space for these forgotten parts of ourselves to emerge, to be integrated, to contribute to our wholeness. The archetypal death we are describing is not a one-time event, but a process that unfolds over months or years. There will be moments when the old pattern reasserts itself, when we slip back into compulsive helping, when we forget the lessons learned through this difficult transformation. This is natural and should be met with patience rather than judgment. The integration of any archetypal change requires time, practice, and the willingness to keep choosing the new way, even when the old way would be easier. As the savior complex gradually dies and is transformed, we begin to serve the world in new ways, ways that honor both our own authenticity and the autonomy of others. We discover that we can be helpful without being compulsive, caring without being codependent, available without being boundaryless. We learn that the most profound service we can offer is the modeling of wholeness, the demonstration that it is possible to be both powerful and vulnerable, both giving and self-caring. The death of the inner savior ultimately serves the collective as well as the individual. By refusing to enable others' dependency, we create space for them to discover their own strength. By no longer absorbing everyone's pain, we allow the natural consequences of their choices to provide the feedback necessary for growth. By transforming our relationship with helping from compulsion to choice, we offer a new model of service that honors the dignity and capacity of both giver and receiver. This transformation ripples outward in ways we may never fully comprehend. Children who witness adults with healthy boundaries learn that they too can protect their energy while still being caring. Friends who are allowed to face their own challenges discover resources within themselves they never knew existed. Communities that are no longer organized around the endless giving of a few begin to develop more equitable and sustainable ways of supporting their members. The death of the savior complex is ultimately a death in service to life, the sacrifice of what is false so that what is true can emerge, the surrender of what is familiar so that what is authentic can be born. It is a death that leads not to emptiness but to fullness, not to isolation but to genuine connection, not to selfishness but to service that arises from wholeness rather than woundedness. In this archetypal death and rebirth, we join the company of all those who have walked the path of individuation before us, those who have been willing to sacrifice their personas in service to their authentic nature, who have chosen growth over comfort, truth over familiarity. We become part of the great human tradition of transformation, taking our place in the eternal cycle of death and renewal that is the heartbeat of consciousness itself. The Savior's cross becomes, in the end, not a symbol of suffering but of transformation, the intersection where the horizontal plane of human relationship meets the vertical dimension of spiritual authenticity, where what we appear to be surrenders to what we truly are, where the death of the false self makes possible the birth of something infinitely more real, more alive, more capable of genuine love than anything we could have imagined when we were still imprisoned within the golden cage of our own goodness. In the aftermath of the Savior's death comes a profound silence, a sacred emptiness that feels both terrifying and pregnant with possibility. It is in this liminal space, this tomb between what was and what will be, that we begin to perceive the architecture of our own soul with new clarity. Like ancient temple builders who understood that sacred space must be carefully constructed, we find ourselves called to become architects of our own emotional sanctuary, learning the divine mathematics of boundaries that protect without imprisoning, that contain without suffocating. The emergence of authentic boundaries is perhaps one of the most misunderstood aspects of psychological development. We have been taught to see boundaries as walls, as barriers that separate and exclude, as evidence of hardness or selfishness, but the soul knows differently. The soul recognizes boundaries as sacred geometry, the fundamental structures that make authentic intimacy possible, the containers that allow love to flow without being dissipated, the frameworks that hold space for the self to emerge without being overwhelmed by the unconscious projections of others. Think of the ancient temples, those masterpieces of sacred architecture that have endured for millennia. Their power comes not from their exclusion of the divine, but from their careful construction of space that can hold the numinous, that can contain the trembling and transformation that occurs when the human encounters the holy. The outer walls do not keep God out. They create the sanctuary within which the divine can be safely experienced, metabolized, integrated without destroying the vessel that seeks to receive it. So too with emotional boundaries. They are not walls built from fear, but sacred thresholds designed with love. Love for ourselves and, paradoxically, love for others. For without proper boundaries, we cannot offer genuine presence. Without the container of our own integrity, we become flooded by the emotional chaos of everyone around us, losing ourselves in the overwhelming tide of others' unconscious material. We become not a sanctuary but a swamp, not a place of refuge, but a repository for everyone else's unprocessed pain. The construction of healthy boundaries begins with a recognition that has been long in coming, the understanding that we are not responsible for managing others' emotional states, that their discomfort is not our emergency, that their inability to regulate themselves does not constitute a crisis that we must solve. This recognition feels like heresy to the part of us that was trained to be the family's emotional barometer, always scanning for signs of distress, always ready to absorb, deflect, or fix whatever threatened the fragile equilibrium of the system. But Jung reminds us that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, requires the courage to disappoint others, to allow them to experience the natural consequences of their own choices, to trust in their capacity for growth even when they themselves have forgotten it. The emergence of boundaries is not an act of abandonment, but an act of faith. Faith in others' resilience, faith in the healing power of authentic relationship, faith in the wisdom of allowing people to walk their own path rather than carrying them along ours. The sacred geometry of emotional boundaries reveals itself in patterns that echo throughout nature and human consciousness. Like the cell membrane that allows nutrients to pass through while keeping toxins out, healthy boundaries are selectively permeable. They welcome what serves our growth while filtering out what would harm or diminish us. They are not rigid walls, but living, responsive structures that can adapt to circumstances while maintaining their essential protective function. Consider the spiral, that fundamental pattern that appears in galaxies and seashells, in DNA and hurricanes, in the growth patterns of consciousness itself. Healthy boundaries often follow this spiral dynamic, expanding and contracting in response to our capacity and circumstances. When we are strong and centered, our boundaries can be more open, more permeable. When we are vulnerable or healing, they may need to contract, to become more protective, more selective about what we allow into our inner sanctuary. The construction of these emotional boundaries requires us to develop what the ancients called discernment, the ability to distinguish between what belongs to us and what belongs to others, between what is our responsibility to heal and what is not, between love and enmeshment, between compassion and codependence. This discernment is not intellectual but visceral, a deep knowing that arises from connection with our own inner authority rather than from external rules or expectations. As we begin to erect these sacred structures around our emotional space, we inevitably encounter resistance, not only from others but from the parts of ourselves that have become addicted to the chaos of boundarylessness. The ego that derived its sense of importance from being needed by everyone begins to panic as it realizes it can no longer access the constant stream of validation that came from absorbing others' problems. The inner child that equated love with merger begins to fear that boundaries mean abandonment, that protecting ourselves means losing connection with those we care about. This internal resistance must be met with infinite compassion, for these parts of us developed their patterns in response to real threats real wounds, real needs that were not met in healthy ways. The child who learned to monitor everyone else's emotions did so because their own emotional needs felt dangerous to express. The part of us that became addicted to fixing others' problems did so because it felt safer to focus on external chaos than to face the chaos within. These parts need our understanding, not our judgment, as we gently guide them toward new ways of seeking safety and connection. The emergence of boundaries as sacred architecture also requires us to confront our own projections, the ways we have unconsciously expected others to read our minds, to intuit our needs, to respect limits we never clearly communicated. The temple builders of old understood that sacred space must be clearly marked, its thresholds visible and unmistakable. So too must we learn to communicate our boundaries with clarity and consistency, not through hints and implications, but through direct, loving expression of what we can and cannot offer, what we will and will not accept. This communication of boundaries often feels foreign to those of us who were raised in families where indirect communication was the norm, where needs were expressed through manipulation rather than direct request, where boundaries were either non-existent or rigidly punitive. Learning to say no with kindness but firmness, to express our limits without apology or over-explanation, to maintain our standards without becoming defensive. These are skills that must be developed through practice, through the willingness to tolerate others' disappointment, through the gradual strengthening of our connection to our own inner authority. The sacred geometry of boundaries also reveals itself in the principle of reciprocity, the understanding that healthy relationships require a balance of giving and receiving, that love flows both ways, that intimacy is built through mutual vulnerability rather than one-sided caretaking. When we begin to construct proper boundaries, we create space not only for ourselves, but for others to step into their own power, to offer their own gifts, to participate in relationship as equals rather than as dependents or recipients of our endless giving. This shift can be profoundly disorienting for relationships that were built around inequality, around the dynamic of rescuer and victim, helper and helped. As we withdraw our compulsive giving and begin to expect reciprocity, some relationships will transform and deepen, revealing their capacity for authentic mutuality. Others will end, unable to survive the death of the dysfunction that held them together. This loss is part of the sacred architecture process, the clearing away of structures that were built on false foundations, to make space for connections that can honor the wholeness of all parties. The construction of emotional boundaries also requires us to develop what Jung called the feeling function, the ability to discern what truly serves our well-being versus what merely appears to serve it. The feeling function helps us distinguish between guilt, which often signals that we are violating someone else's expectations, and guilt, which signals that we are violating our own values. It helps us recognize the difference between loneliness, which might indicate a need for connection, and loneliness, which might indicate that we are surrounded by people who do not truly see or value our authentic self. As these boundaries begin to take shape, we discover that they do not isolate us from love, but create the conditions in which love can flourish. The temple walls do not keep the divine out. They create sacred space in which transformation can occur safely. Similarly, our emotional boundaries do not prevent intimacy. They make authentic intimacy possible by ensuring that when we connect with others, we are connecting as whole beings, rather than as fragments desperate for completion through merger. The sacred geometry of boundaries also teaches us about the relationship between structure and freedom. The ancient Greeks understood this principle in their architecture, that it is the columns and walls that make possible the open spaces, that it is the careful attention to proportion and limitation that creates buildings capable of inspiring awe and wonder. Without structure, there is only chaos. Without boundaries, there is only enmeshment. When we learn to honor our own boundaries, we naturally begin to respect others' boundaries as well. We stop trying to rescue people who haven't asked to be saved. We cease attempting to manage others' emotions or solve their problems. We no longer take responsibility for their reactions to our authentic self-expression. This shift creates space for others to develop their own relationship with their challenges, their own capacity for self-regulation, their own connection to their inner wisdom. The process of constructing healthy boundaries often brings up profound grief. Grief for the years we spent giving ourselves away. Grief for the relationships that couldn't survive our growth. Grief for the parts of ourselves that were sacrificed in service to others' comfort. This grief is sacred work, for it honors what was while making space for what can be. It is the composting process through which the death of our old patterns becomes the fertile ground for new growth. As our boundaries become more established, we begin to notice subtle changes in our energy, our presence, our capacity for joy. The constant drain of absorbing others' emotions begins to slow, then stop. We find that we have energy available for our own dreams, our own healing, our own creative expression. We discover interests and talents that were buried beneath years of focusing exclusively on others' needs. We reconnect with the person we were before we learned to disappear ourselves in service to everyone else's comfort. The sacred architecture of boundaries also reveals itself in the principle of selectivity, the understanding that we cannot be all things to all people. That authentic relationship requires us to be discerning about where we invest our emotional energy. The temple is not open to every visitor at every hour. There are times for gathering and times for solitude, times for giving and times for receiving, times for engagement and times for retreat. Learning to honor these natural rhythms, to give ourselves permission to be unavailable when we need restoration, to choose consciously rather than respond compulsively. These become acts of self-respect that model healthy relationship for everyone around us. The construction of emotional boundaries as sacred geometry also requires us to confront our own worthiness, the deep, often unconscious belief that we don't deserve to take up space, to have needs, to expect consideration from others. This belief system, usually formed in early childhood, convinces us that love must be earned through service, that acceptance comes only through self-sacrifice, that our value lies in our utility rather than our being. The emergence of healthy boundaries challenges these core beliefs, asking us to claim our inherent right to exist without apology, to need without shame, to want without guilt. This claiming of our worthiness often triggers what Jung called the persecutory anxiety, the fear that if we stop sacrificing ourselves for others, we will be abandoned, rejected, punished. This fear is not irrational. It is based on real experiences of conditional love, of acceptance that depended on our willingness to disappear, our authentic needs. But the courage to maintain boundaries in the face of this fear is what allows us to discover whether our relationships are built on love or on need, on genuine appreciation for who we are or on addiction to what we provide. As the sacred architecture of our emotional boundaries becomes more refined, we begin to understand the difference between healthy privacy and secretive hiding, between appropriate self-protection and defensive withdrawal. Healthy boundaries are transparent. They communicate clearly what we can and cannot offer, what we need and what we cannot accept. They are not built from shame, but from self-respect, not from fear, but from love, not from judgment, but from discernment. The temple builders understood that sacred architecture must serve both protection and accessibility. The structure must be strong enough to contain the power that gathers within it, while remaining permeable to those who approach with reverence and genuine intent. Our emotional boundaries follow the same principle. They protect us from those who would exploit or diminish us, while remaining open to those who can meet us with respect, reciprocity, and authentic care. The emergence of boundaries as sacred geometry ultimately transforms not only our relationship with ourselves, but our understanding of love itself. We begin to see that love without boundaries is not love, but enmeshment. That care without limits is not compassion, but codependence. That giving without discernment is not generosity, but compulsion. True love honors both self and other, both autonomy and connection, both individual authenticity and relational harmony. This transformation ripples outward in ways that serve not only our personal healing but the collective evolution of consciousness. When we model healthy boundaries, we give others permission to develop their own. When we refuse to enable dysfunction, we create space for health to emerge. When we love from wholeness rather than need, we offer a template for relationships that honor the dignity and autonomy of all participants. The sacred geometry of emotional boundaries becomes, in time, not a structure we must maintain through effort, but a natural expression of our authentic self, as organic and effortless as the cell membrane that protects, while allowing life to flow, as beautiful and functional as the spiral patterns that govern growth throughout the natural world. In learning to construct these sacred containers for our emotional life, we discover that boundaries are not barriers to love, but the very architecture that makes authentic love possible. There comes a moment in the great work of becoming when the fire that once burned wild and destructive within us begins to steady into something altogether more sacred. This is not the taming of rage. No, that would be another betrayal, another severing from our vital essence. This is transmutation, the alchemical mystery by which the base metal of our anger transforms into the pure gold of sovereign fire. Listen closely, for this is the voice of your deepest wisdom speaking. The rage you have carried, the fury you have feared, the anger you have hidden from the world and from yourself. This is not your enemy. It has never been your enemy. It is the guardian at the threshold of your most sacred temple, the protector of your soul's inviolate boundaries. But for so long you did not know how to work with this fire. You let it burn you from within, or you cast it outward like molten lava, scorching everything in its path. The child in you learned early that anger was dangerous. Perhaps you witnessed rage that destroyed, that left nothing but ash and trauma in its wake. Perhaps you felt the weight of disapproval when your own fire sparked to life, saw how quickly love could be withdrawn when you dared to burn bright with indignation. And so you learned to compress this flame, to stuff it deep into the caverns of your being, where it smoldered in the darkness, feeding on your own flesh. Or perhaps you learned the opposite lesson, that anger was power, that it could bend others to your will, make them step back, make them fear. You wielded it like a sword, cutting through resistance, demanding space through intimidation rather than sovereignty. But this too was a distortion, a shadow dance that kept you from knowing the true nature of your fire. Both responses, the turning inward and the turning outward, emerge from the same fundamental misunderstanding. They arise from a consciousness that has not yet learned to distinguish between the reactive anger of the wounded ego and the sacred rage of the awakening self. One burns everything it touches, the other illuminates the very boundaries of what is holy. In the great mandala of psychological wholeness that Jung mapped for us, anger occupies a crucial position. It is the energy that says no when no must be said. It is the force that rises when our essential nature is threatened, when someone or something seeks to violate the sanctuary of our being. Without this energy, we become victims, not of others, but of our own failure to protect what is most precious within us. Yet the ego's relationship to anger is always problematic. The ego takes things personally. It feels attacked when criticized, diminished when ignored, enraged when its desires are thwarted. The ego's anger is reactive, defensive, often disproportionate to the actual threat. It burns like wildfire, consuming everything, leaving scorched earth in its wake. But there is another kind of anger, one that emerges not from the wounded ego, but from the sovereign self. This is the anger of the mother bear protecting her cubs, the fierce love that will not allow violation of the sacred. This anger does not take things personally because it emerges from an impersonal source, the deep self that knows what must be protected and what must be preserved. The journey from ego-driven reactivity to self-directed sovereignty is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of individuation. It requires us to develop what we might call conscious anger, the ability to feel our fire without being consumed by it, to express our boundaries without destroying those who test them. This transformation cannot happen through suppression. The spiritual bypassing that seeks to transcend anger altogether only drives it deeper into the shadow, where it ferments into bitterness, resentment, and eventually a kind of spiritual poison that seeps through everything we touch. The person who claims to be beyond anger is often the most dangerous of all, for their rage has gone underground, expressing itself through passive aggression, manipulation, and a cold violence that masquerades as spirituality. Neither can this transformation happen through indulgence. The therapeutic culture that encourages us to let it all out often mistakes catharsis for healing, expression for integration. Screaming at pillows, pounding foam bats, venting our rage without consciousness. These may provide temporary relief, but they do not transform the fundamental pattern. They do not teach us the crucial difference between reactive and responsive anger. The alchemical process of transmutation requires something else entirely. It requires us to develop a relationship with our anger that is neither suppressive nor indulgent, but truly conscious. We must learn to feel our fire without being burned by it, to know its message without being overwhelmed by its intensity. This begins with recognition. When anger arises, we must pause, not to suppress it, but to inquire into its nature. What is this fire trying to protect? What boundary is being crossed? What sacred territory is under threat? Is this the reactive anger of the wounded ego, or the responsive fire of the awakening self? The ego's anger feels personal, urgent, demanding immediate action. It narrows our vision, focuses our energy on attack or defense. It makes us feel righteous in our fury, justified in our desire to punish or control. This anger feeds on thoughts of victimization, replaying the story of how we have been wronged, building a case for our indignation. The self's anger feels different. It is cooler, more centered, arising from a deeper place of knowing. It does not need to justify itself through stories of victimization. It simply knows that a boundary must be established, that something sacred must be protected. This anger expands rather than contracts our awareness. It makes us larger, not smaller. It connects us to something eternal rather than fixating on the temporary. Learning to distinguish between these two forms of anger is the beginning of wisdom, but recognition alone is not enough. We must also learn the art of conscious expression, how to let our fire burn without setting everything ablaze. This is where the image of the guardian flame becomes so powerful. Picture the eternal flame that burns at the entrance to a sacred temple. It is always burning, always vigilant, but it does not rage out of control. It burns with purpose, with discrimination. It warms those who approach with reverence and sincerity. It burns away what is false or harmful, but it does not consume the temple itself. Your anger, when properly understood and consciously wielded, becomes just such a flame. It burns at the threshold of your being, protecting your sacred space. It does not attack others, but it also does not allow violation of what is holy. It discriminates, warming what deserves welcome, burning away what seeks to harm. This transformation of anger into sacred fire is one of the great tasks of the warrior archetype within us. Jung spoke of the need to integrate all aspects of our nature, including those we might prefer to disown. The warrior energy, the capacity for fierce protection, for standing our ground, for saying no when no must be said, is essential to psychological wholeness. But the warrior must serve the self, not the ego. The ego-driven warrior fights for personal advantage, for dominance, for the satisfaction of being right. The self-directed warrior fights only for what is sacred, only for what truly needs protection. This warrior knows when to sheathe the sword and when to draw it, when to stand firm and when to yield. In many spiritual traditions, this integration is symbolized by the image of the fierce deity, the wrathful face of compassion. These figures, found in Tibetan Buddhism and other wisdom traditions, appear terrifying to the ego mind, but are actually expressions of enlightened energy. Their fierce appearance burns away illusion, protects what is sacred, and clears the space for truth to emerge. This is the quality of energy you are learning to embody as you transmute your anger into sovereign fire. You become fierce in service to love, wrathful in defense of what is sacred. Your boundaries become clear and unassailable, not through aggression, but through an unmistakable emanation of self-respect that cannot be violated. The process of this transmutation often involves a kind of death and rebirth. The old patterns of anger, both the suppressive and the explosive, must die for the new form to emerge. This death is rarely comfortable. It requires us to sit with the fire of our rage without immediately acting on it, to feel its intensity without being consumed by it. In this space of conscious holding, something miraculous happens. The raw energy of anger begins to refine itself. Like metal in a forge, it is purified by the very heat that once threatened to destroy us. The reactive patterns begin to fall away, and what remains is pure energy, clean, powerful, and perfectly aligned with our deepest values. This is not a process that happens once and is finished. It is an ongoing practice, a continuous refinement of our relationship with this powerful energy. Each time anger arises, we have another opportunity to choose consciousness over reactivity, transformation over destruction. As you deepen into this practice, you begin to notice subtle changes. Your anger becomes less frequent but more accurate. When it arises, it points to something genuinely important rather than to every minor irritation. You find yourself able to say no with clarity and firmness without needing to raise your voice or justify your position extensively. Your presence itself begins to communicate your boundaries. People around you respond differently as well. The chronic people-pleasers who once took advantage of your inability to set boundaries begin to respect you more. The aggressive personalities who once bulldozed over your preferences find themselves naturally stepping back from your centered energy. You attract relationships based on mutual respect rather than power struggles or codependency. This transformation also affects your relationship with your own shadow, the aspects of yourself that you once judged harshly, your capacity for fierceness, your intolerance of disrespect, your readiness to defend what you value, are no longer seen as character flaws to be overcome, but as sacred energies to be consecrated in service to wholeness. You begin to understand that the very intensity of your anger often reflects the depth of your love. We become most enraged when what we care about most deeply is threatened. The parent's fury at harm to their child, the artist's rage at the destruction of beauty, the lover's anger at betrayal. These fires burn so bright precisely because they emerge from the depths of caring. When anger is transmuted into sovereign fire, it becomes a form of love in action. It is love protecting itself, love establishing its boundaries, love refusing to be diminished or violated. This understanding transforms not only how you express anger, but how you receive it from others. You begin to see through the reactive surface to the protected vulnerability beneath. The mythology of many cultures speaks to this transformation. The Greek goddess Athena, springing fully formed from Zeus's head, represents wisdom that includes the capacity for fierce protection. The Hindu goddess Durga, riding her lion into battle against demons, embodies divine feminine energy that is both nurturing and fiercely protective. These archetypal images live within the collective unconscious, offering templates for the integration of our own warrior energy. As you embody this archetypal pattern, you find yourself naturally stepping into situations that require protection, not just of yourself, but of others who cannot protect themselves. You become a guardian of what is sacred in the world, a protector of the vulnerable, a fierce advocate for truth and justice. Your anger serves something larger than your personal grievances. This is the Enantiodromia Jung spoke of, the tendency of any extreme position to eventually turn into its opposite. The anger that once seemed so destructive reveals itself as a guardian energy. The fire that once burned everything becomes the sacred flame that illuminates and protects. What appeared to be your greatest weakness is revealed as one of your most important strengths. In the great work of individuation, this integration of our warrior nature is essential. We cannot become whole while disowning our capacity for fierceness. We cannot be authentically loving while being unable to say no to what would harm what we love. The path to wholeness requires us to embrace all of our energies and learn to express them in service to our highest self. The sacred fire of transmuted anger becomes one of your most reliable guides on this journey. It alerts you when you are betraying yourself, when you are allowing violation of your deepest values, when you are settling for less than what your soul knows it deserves. It is the energy that propels you forward when the path becomes difficult, that burns through the obstacles that would keep you from your true destiny. As this integration deepens, you discover that anger and compassion are not opposites, but two faces of the same sacred energy. The heart that can burn with righteous anger at injustice is the same heart that can open with infinite tenderness to suffering. The fire that protects what is sacred is kindled from the same source as the love that seeks to serve and heal. This understanding brings a profound peace, not the peace of suppression or spiritual bypassing, but the peace of a warrior who knows their strength and uses it wisely. You rest in the knowledge that you can protect what needs protecting, that you have the inner fire necessary to defend what is sacred, that your love is not weak or naive, but fierce and wise. The guardian flame burns steady at the threshold of your being. It does not rage or storm, but its very presence is unmistakable. Those who approach with respect and genuine intention are welcomed into warmth. Those who come with harmful intent find themselves naturally stepping back from its intensity. And you, the keeper of this sacred fire, dwell in the center of your own temple, sovereign and serene. In this way, your anger is no longer something that happens to you. It becomes something you are in conscious relationship with. It serves your deepest values, protects what is most precious, and burns with the sacred intensity of love itself. You have learned the great alchemical secret, that the very energy which once seemed to threaten your peace has become the guardian of your sovereignty. This is the gift of integrated anger, the blessing of transmuted fire. It does not make you aggressive or difficult. It makes you real, boundaried, and authentically powerful. It allows you to love without losing yourself, to serve without becoming a doormat, to open your heart while still protecting what is sacred within it. As you continue on this journey of individuation, carry this sacred fire with awareness and reverence. Let it burn bright when protection is needed. Let it warm those who deserve welcome. And let it always serve the highest self that is emerging through your conscious choice to become who you truly are. For in learning to work with your anger in this way, you have not overcome a weakness. You have consecrated a strength, transformed a burden into a blessing, and discovered one of the most essential aspects of your authentic power. There comes a moment in the great unraveling when the fog of personal responsibility begins to lift, and we see with startling clarity that the storm clouds gathering in others' eyes are not reflections of our failures, but revelations of their own inner weather. This recognition arrives like dawn breaking across a battlefield, where we have fought countless wars that were never ours to win. For so long, we have carried the weight of others' emotional reactions as if they were sacred stones placed in our palms by divine decree. When they raged, we assumed we had lit the fire. When they withdrew, we believed we had built the walls. When they manipulated, we convinced ourselves we had handed them the puppet strings. But now, standing in this new territory of selfhood, we begin to see the ancient pattern that has governed human relationship since time immemorial, the unconscious habit of placing our unlived life, our unhealed wounds, our disowned parts onto the canvas of another's being. Jung knew this dance well, this projection of the psyche's contents onto the outer world. He understood that what we cannot bear to see in ourselves, we will inevitably see reflected in the faces of those around us. The very qualities that trigger our most intense reactions in others are often the rejected aspects of our own nature, banished to the shadow realms of unconsciousness, only to emerge as seemingly external demons wearing familiar faces. But you, dear traveler of the depths, have begun to recognize this phenomenon not as a cosmic joke played at your expense, but as an intricate system of healing that operates through the mysterious mechanics of human projection. Each person who responds to your newfound boundaries with intensity is offering you and themselves a profound gift wrapped in the rough paper of emotional reactivity. When someone explodes in anger at your gentle no, they are not revealing your cruelty. They are revealing their own relationship with autonomy, their own terror of abandonment, disguised as righteous indignation. Their fury is not about your boundary. It is about the boundary they have never learned to create for themselves. The no they have swallowed 1,000 times until it fermented into rage in the dark cellars of their being. This recognition does not come as intellectual understanding alone. It arrives as a visceral knowing that moves through your nervous system like electricity finding its ground. You feel it in the way your solar plexus no longer contracts when faced with another's disappointment. You sense it in the curious lightness that settles over your shoulders when someone accuses you of selfishness. Where once you would have rushed to defend, explain, or modify your position, now you find yourself standing in the eye of their storm, witnessing their weather without making it your own. The disappointed sighs, the subtle guilt trips, the dramatic pronouncements about how you have changed. All of these become transparent as soon as you recognize them for what they truly are. Desperate attempts by the psyche to maintain the familiar patterns of enmeshment that have kept both parties locked in unconscious dance. The part of them that has never learned to self-soothe reaches out through manipulation, hoping to restore the old dynamic where your presence served as their emotional regulation system. But perhaps most remarkable is the recognition that their projections are not random arrows shot in anger. They are precisely calibrated medicine doses, delivered with unconscious accuracy to the very wounds that most need attention. When someone calls you selfish for prioritizing your needs, they are speaking directly to the part of themselves that has forgotten how to engage in healthy self-care. When they label your boundaries as mean or uncaring, they are addressing their own abandoned inner child who learned that love meant erasure of personal limits. This is not to minimize the sting of their words or the temporary chaos that ensues when familiar patterns are disrupted. The human heart, even the awakening one, still feels the impact of harsh judgment and withdrawn affection. But now these experiences pass through you differently, like rain through a forest canopy, touching you, nourishing certain parts, but not flooding the roots of your being with the old, familiar shame. You begin to see that every person who cannot tolerate your healthy boundaries is simultaneously revealing the boundaries they need to create in their own lives. Their discomfort with your no illuminates their inability to say no to the demands that drain them. Their anger at your self-care exposes their own self-abandonment. Their manipulation tactics become transparent maps, showing you exactly where their own power has been given away. In this recognition lies a profound compassion, not the codependent compassion that rushes to fix or accommodate, but the fierce compassion that allows others the dignity of their own healing journey. You begin to understand that by maintaining your boundaries in the face of their projections, you are offering them the most loving gift possible, a mirror that shows them exactly what they need to see about their own relationship with autonomy, self-worth, and authentic connection. The person who cannot tolerate your success is being shown their own discomfort with abundance. The one who punishes your joy reveals their own complicated relationship with pleasure and celebration. The individual who grows cold when you prioritize your well-being is encountering their own abandonment of self-care disguised as care for others. Each reaction becomes a precise diagnostic tool, revealing not your inadequacy but their unrealized potential. This shift in perception transforms the entire landscape of relationship. Where once you saw a minefield of potential triggers and reactions to navigate, you now see a garden of healing opportunities, blooming in the soil of human projection. Each difficult interaction becomes an invitation for the other person to reclaim a disowned part of themselves, though you recognize with deep wisdom that you cannot force this recognition upon them. The guilt that once consumed you when others reacted poorly to your boundaries begins to dissolve, replaced by a kind of sacred detachment that Jung might have called wise compassion. You learn to hold space for others' projections without absorbing them into your energy field, like a skilled therapist who can sit with a client's pain without taking it home in their nervous system. This does not mean becoming cold or indifferent, quite the opposite. Your heart actually opens more fully when it is no longer armored against the weight of others' emotional dysregulation. You can feel genuine empathy for their struggle, while simultaneously recognizing that their struggle belongs to them, not to you. You can witness their healing process with love, while refusing to become enmeshed in their resistance to growth. Sometimes the most challenging aspect of this recognition is the loneliness that accompanies it. When you can clearly see the projection patterns that govern most human interactions, you may feel isolated in your awareness, like someone who has learned a new language, while everyone around you continues speaking in the old tongue of unconscious reactivity and blame. But this loneliness carries within it the seeds of authentic connection. For as you stop participating in the projection dance, you create space for relationships based on genuine recognition rather than unconscious mutual enablement. The people who can meet you in this new territory of conscious relating become treasured companions, fellow travelers who have done their own work of reclaiming their projections and owning their emotional weather. You learn to recognize the difference between someone who is genuinely hurt by a necessary boundary and someone who is using emotional manipulation to restore the old dynamic. Genuine hurt feels clean, even when painful. It acknowledges the impact while respecting your right to make the choice. Manipulative hurt carries the sticky energy of entitlement, the demand that you sacrifice your well-being to manage their discomfort. The recognition of projections as medicine extends beyond the obvious dramatic reactions to include the subtler forms of projection that weave through daily interactions. The colleague who seems threatened by your confidence is encountering their own disowned power. The friend who grows distant when you achieve something meaningful is meeting their own unrealized potential. The family member who criticizes your choices is facing the parts of themselves they have never allowed to flourish. Each of these encounters becomes an opportunity for compassion without enmeshment, understanding without enabling. You begin to see that the highest form of love is often maintaining your boundaries in the face of others' discomfort, allowing them the sacred struggle of growing into their own authentic selfhood rather than diminishing yourself to ease their journey. This recognition also reveals the profound responsibility that comes with conscious awareness. Once you can see the projection patterns clearly, you cannot unsee them. You become accountable for your responses in a new way, called to meet others' unconsciousness with consciousness, rather than reactive defensiveness. This does not mean becoming a doormat or spiritual bypassing legitimate concerns. It means responding from your centered self rather than your triggered ego. The practice becomes one of witnessing without absorbing, of offering your solid presence as a mirror for others' growth, without becoming responsible for what they choose to see or ignore in that reflection. You learn that the most profound gift you can offer another human being is your own wholeness, your own commitment to conscious living, regardless of how they choose to respond to that offering. Sometimes the medicine of your boundaries works immediately. The person recognizes their projection, takes responsibility for their reaction, and grows into greater self-awareness. More often, the medicine works slowly, like homeopathic doses delivered over time through consistent modeling of healthy relationship dynamics. And sometimes the medicine is refused entirely, the person choosing to maintain their projections rather than face the discomfort of reclaiming their disowned parts. In all cases, your role remains the same: to maintain your integrity, to respond with consciousness rather than reactivity, and to trust that each person's soul knows exactly what medicine they need, even when their personality resists the healing process. You learn to offer your authentic presence as a gift while detaching from the outcomes, understanding that transformation is an inside job that cannot be forced from the outside. The liberation that comes with this recognition is profound. No longer do you carry the crushing weight of being responsible for others' emotional states. No longer do you need to dim your light to keep others comfortable in their darkness. No longer must you sacrifice your truth to maintain the illusion of harmony. Instead, you become a beacon of authentic selfhood, inviting others through your example to reclaim their own projections and step into their own power. This shift marks the beginning of what Jung called conscious relationship, connection based on mutual recognition of wholeness rather than unconscious symbiosis fed by projected neediness. It is the foundation upon which all mature love is built, the bedrock of authentic intimacy that can withstand the storms of human growth and change. As you settle into this new way of being, you may notice that some relationships naturally fall away, unable to survive without the projection patterns that once held them together. This can be grievous, yet also liberating, For what is lost are illusions of connection that were never truly nourishing to either party. What remains and what newly enters your life are relationships rooted in genuine recognition and mutual respect for each person's sovereignty. The recognition of others' projections as their medicine becomes a lens through which all of life's interactions gain new meaning. Every difficult conversation becomes a potential healing encounter. Every conflict reveals an opportunity for growth. Every rejection shows you someone who is not yet ready to see their own light reflected in your eyes. And in this recognition you find not bitterness, but boundless compassion for the human journey of awakening, knowing that each soul moves at its own pace toward the light of conscious living. In this space of recognition, you become what Jung called a transformer of consciousness, not through preaching or teaching, but through the simple radical act of maintaining your authentic presence in a world that often rewards unconscious conformity. Your boundaries become medicine not just for you, but for everyone who encounters them, whether they choose to swallow that medicine or spit it out. And in offering this gift, you participate in the ancient healing work of human consciousness, one interaction at a time. There exists within you a faculty so refined, so exquisitely attuned to the subtle currents of human interaction, that it rivals the most sophisticated instruments of detection. This is your energetic discernment, the capacity to sense the quality of another's presence, the texture of their intentions, the very frequency at which their soul vibrates. What was once your curse, the overwhelming sensitivity that left you drowning in others' emotions, is revealing itself to be your greatest gift. For too long, you experienced this sensitivity as a burden. You walked into rooms and immediately felt the undercurrents of tension, the unexpressed grief, the simmering resentments that others seemed oblivious to. You absorbed these energies like a sponge, carrying home the emotional residue of every interaction, never knowing where others' feelings ended and your own began. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive, that you needed to develop a thicker skin, that your responses to the emotional atmosphere around you were excessive or inappropriate. You may have tried to numb this sensitivity through various means: substances, distractions, the desperate attempt to fit in by pretending you didn't feel what you so clearly felt. But nothing could silence this inner radar, this deep knowing that registered truths others seemed to miss entirely. What you did not understand then, what perhaps no one taught you, is that sensitivity of this magnitude is not a flaw in your design, but a feature of it. You are what Jung might have recognized as one of those souls naturally attuned to the collective unconscious, able to sense the archetypal currents moving beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. Your nervous system, your very cellular structure, is calibrated to detect subtleties that most people cannot perceive. But there is a vast difference between being unconsciously sensitive and developing conscious discernment. The first leaves you at the mercy of every emotional wind that blows through your environment. The second transforms you into a master navigator of the invisible realms, able to read the energetic weather patterns with the skill of an ancient mariner reading the stars. This transformation does not happen overnight. It requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your sensitivity, from seeing it as something that happens to you to recognizing it as a capacity you can develop and direct. Like a master perfumer who has trained their nose to detect the most subtle notes in a complex fragrance, you must learn to distinguish between different types of energetic information and respond to each appropriately. The untrained sensitive absorbs everything indiscriminately. They feel the checkout clerk's exhaustion, the stranger's anxiety on the bus, the friend's hidden resentment, all with equal intensity, all as if it were their own emotion. They become overwhelmed because they have no framework for understanding what they're experiencing, no tools for protecting their own energetic integrity, while remaining open to the information their sensitivity provides. But as you awaken to the true nature of your gift, you begin to develop what we might call energetic literacy. You learn to read the subtle signs that precede emotional storms, to sense the quality of someone's attention before they speak, to feel the difference between authentic vulnerability and manipulative emotional display. This capacity emerges from a deep understanding of energy itself. Everything in the universe vibrates at particular frequencies. Every thought, every emotion, every intention creates its own energetic signature. Your sensitivity allows you to detect these signatures with remarkable precision if you know how to interpret what you're receiving. Consider the master perfumer at work. They do not simply smell, they decode. They can detect the top notes that hit first, the heart notes that emerge after initial contact, and the base notes that linger longest. They understand how different elements combine and transform over time. They know which scents harmonize and which clash. Most importantly, they can distinguish between natural and synthetic fragrances, between authentic and imitation expressions. Your energetic discernment works in precisely this way. You begin to notice the top notes of someone's presence, the immediate impression they project, the persona they present to the world. But you also become aware of the deeper currents, the emotional undertones that reveal their true state of being. You learn to sense whether someone's kindness is genuine or performed, whether their confidence is authentic or compensatory. This discernment protects you in ways that simple boundaries cannot. Physical boundaries tell you what to do after someone has already entered your space uninvited. Energetic discernment allows you to sense the quality of someone's approach before they fully arrive. It gives you the gift of choosing your engagements from wisdom rather than reacting from unconscious habit. The person who has developed this capacity can sense a manipulative approach while it is still forming in the other person's mind. They feel the shift in someone's energy when they move from authentic connection into agenda-driven interaction. They notice when someone is projecting their own unresolved material rather than relating to what is actually present. This is not paranoia or hypervigilance. Those are fear-based states that distort perception. True energetic discernment emerges from a place of centered awareness. It is curious rather than defensive, discerning rather than judgmental. It seeks to understand the energetic dynamics at play without necessarily taking them personally. As this faculty develops, you discover that most people are broadcasting their internal state constantly, usually without awareness. The person who claims to be fine while radiating distress, the individual who speaks of love while emanating neediness, the colleague who offers help while vibrating with resentment. Your sensitivity reads these contradictions long before the conscious mind processes them. But perhaps most importantly, you learn to sense authenticity, that rare and precious quality that emerges when someone is genuinely aligned with themselves. Authentic presence has an unmistakable frequency. It feels spacious rather than contracted, grounded rather than scattered, present rather than performative. When you encounter it, something in you recognizes and responds to its truth. This recognition becomes one of your most reliable guides in choosing whom to trust with your energy. You learn that credentials, reputation, even past relationship history matter less than the quality of presence someone brings in the moment. The person who radiates authentic care, even if imperfect in their expression, becomes someone you can trust. The individual who performs caring while operating from hidden agendas registers as unsafe, regardless of their charm or social standing. As your discernment sharpens, you also become aware of the energetic impact of your own presence. You begin to notice how your moods, thoughts, and intentions affect the spaces you enter. This awareness brings both power and responsibility. You realize that your sensitivity works both ways. Just as you can read others' energy, they are responding to yours, often unconsciously. This understanding transforms how you move through the world. You become more conscious of the energy you're broadcasting, more intentional about the frequencies you're amplifying. You learn to clear your own field before entering sensitive situations, to ground yourself when dealing with chaotic energy, to maintain your center while remaining open to necessary information. The development of energetic discernment also reveals the profound interconnectedness of all life. You begin to sense the web of invisible connections that link all beings, the ways that consciousness moves through collective fields, the manner in which individual healing contributes to the healing of the whole. Your sensitivity becomes a bridge between your personal experience and the transpersonal dimensions of existence. This expanded awareness often brings with it a deep sense of responsibility. You realize that your gifts come with a calling to use your discernment in service of something larger than personal protection. You may find yourself naturally gravitating toward roles where this sensitivity serves healing, whether as a counselor, teacher, artist, or simply as someone who holds space for truth in their daily interactions. But the path of the sensitive soul is not without its challenges. The same capacity that allows you to detect authenticity also makes you acutely aware of deception, manipulation, and unconscious wounding. You may go through periods where the world feels almost unbearably harsh, where the prevalence of unconscious behavior makes you want to retreat entirely from human contact. This is where the wisdom of sacred boundaries becomes essential. Your discernment must be coupled with the ability to choose your engagements consciously. Not every person who approaches you requires your full attention. Not every energetic disturbance needs your healing response. Learning to discern not only what you can perceive, but what you are called to engage with becomes crucial to maintaining your own well-being. There is an art to being sensitively present without being overwhelmed. It requires what we might call permeable boundaries, the ability to remain open to information while maintaining your energetic integrity. Like a master musician who can hear every instrument in the orchestra, while focusing on their own part, you learn to be aware of the energetic symphony around you while maintaining your own center. This skill develops through practice and self-awareness. You learn to breathe consciously when entering challenging energetic environments. You discover grounding techniques that help you maintain your own frequency while navigating others' emotional states. You develop the ability to witness without absorbing, to understand without taking on. As your discernment matures, you also begin to work with energy proactively rather than merely defensively. You learn to sense potential conflicts before they erupt and either address them skillfully or remove yourself from harm's way. You become able to feel the approach of opportunities, the presence of kindred spirits, the emerging possibilities that others might miss entirely. This proactive capacity transforms your entire experience of life. Instead of feeling like a victim of random energetic encounters, you become a conscious navigator of the invisible currents. You begin to trust your first impressions, knowing that they often contain information your rational mind hasn't yet processed. You learn to follow energetic trails toward experiences and relationships that truly serve your growth. The development of this faculty also deepens your relationship with intuition. Jung spoke of intuition as one of the 4 primary psychological functions, and for the naturally sensitive soul, it often becomes the most developed and reliable. Your energetic discernment feeds your intuitive knowing, providing the raw data from which deeper insights emerge. You begin to trust those subtle promptings that arise from seemingly nowhere, the sudden knowing that you should take a different route home, the inexplicable feeling that someone needs your attention, the inner voice that warns you away from seemingly attractive opportunities. These promptings are often your sensitivity detecting patterns and potentials that haven't yet manifested in obvious ways. As this trust deepens, you discover that your sensitivity connects you to sources of guidance beyond your personal consciousness. You may begin to sense the presence of what various traditions call guides, ancestors, or archetypal energies, sources of wisdom that seem to communicate through the same channels that detect human emotion. This connection to transpersonal sources of information marks a crucial stage in the evolution of your sensitivity. You begin to understand that your gift connects you not only to the immediate emotional environment, but to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. Your discernment becomes a form of divination, a way of reading the signs and portents that guide you toward your authentic path. Yet even as your sensitivity develops into this refined instrument of perception, it's important to remember that it serves love, not fear. The highest expression of energetic discernment is not the ability to detect every form of potential harm, but the capacity to recognize and respond to genuine need, authentic connection, and opportunities for mutual growth. You learn to sense not only what to avoid, but what to move toward. Your discernment guides you to the people, places, and experiences that genuinely nourish your soul. It helps you recognize when someone is offering you a gift, even if wrapped in unfamiliar packaging. It allows you to sense potential in situations that others might dismiss or overlook. This positive application of your sensitivity becomes increasingly important as you mature in your gifts. The world needs people who can sense what wants to emerge, who can feel the stirrings of new possibilities, who can detect the authentic beneath the superficial. Your discernment becomes a service to the collective awakening of consciousness. In the great work of individuation, the development of energetic discernment represents a crucial integration. You learn to honor your sensitivity while not being overwhelmed by it. You develop the capacity to navigate complex energetic environments while maintaining your authenticity. You discover how to use your gifts in service of something larger while protecting your own well-being. This integration transforms what was once your greatest vulnerability into one of your most reliable strengths. The same sensitivity that left you feeling exposed and overwhelmed becomes the foundation for a deep wisdom about human nature and the subtle forces that shape our interactions. As you embody this mastery, you become a blessing to others, someone who can sense what is needed, who responds to authentic calls for help, who creates spaces where truth can be spoken and healing can occur. Your presence becomes a gift to a world that desperately needs people who can see beyond the surface, who can respond to what is real rather than what is merely projected. The awakening of energetic discernment marks your graduation from unconscious sensitivity to conscious perception. You have learned to read the invisible language that surrounds all human interaction. You have developed the capacity to navigate by inner compass rather than outer appearances. Most importantly, you have discovered how to use your extraordinary sensitivity as a bridge between worlds, connecting the seen and unseen, the spoken and unspoken, the conscious and unconscious dimensions of existence. This is your gift to yourself and to the world, the ability to sense what is true, to respond to what is real, and to navigate the complex energetic landscape of human relationship with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering authenticity. In developing this discernment, you have not only protected yourself, you have become a guardian of truth in a world that often settles for the superficial, a beacon of authentic perception in an ocean of projection and pretense. In the deepening chambers of your becoming, there comes a loneliness unlike any you have known before. It is not the aching emptiness of abandonment or the desperate hunger for connection that once drove you into relationships that diminished rather than expanded your being. This is something altogether more profound, a sacred solitude that arrives not as punishment but as invitation, not as evidence of your unworthiness but as recognition of your readiness for a deeper kind of intimacy, the intimacy with your own essential self. This loneliness emerges as a natural consequence of your growing authenticity, as you shed the masks you once wore to gain acceptance, as you stop contorting yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for your true shape. You discover that many of the connections you thought you treasured were actually connections to your false presentations rather than to your authentic being. The loneliness you feel now is the space left behind by these superficial bonds, the clearing that must occur before genuine intimacy becomes possible. At first, this solitude may feel like exile. You look around and see others seemingly comfortable in their connections, apparently content with relationships built on shared illusions and mutual projections. They laugh together at jokes that don't amuse you, find comfort in conversations that feel hollow to your awakening consciousness, derive security from bonds that seem to you like prisons of mutual limitation. There is a grief in this recognition, the mourning of the innocent times when you too could find satisfaction in such connections. Part of you may long to return to the unconscious ease of fitting in, of belonging without question, of being loved for who you pretended to be, rather than facing the uncertainty of whether anyone will love who you actually are. But consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The very authenticity that creates this loneliness also makes the old forms of connection impossible. You cannot unknow what you now know about yourself. You cannot unfeel the depths you have discovered within your being. You cannot return to the shallows once you have tasted the profound. This sacred loneliness serves a purpose that only becomes clear in its full embrace. It is the womb space of transformation, the necessary emptiness in which your true self can fully gestate and be born. In the absence of others' expectations, projections, and demands for your energy, aspects of yourself that have been dormant for lifetimes begin to stir and awaken. Jung understood this necessity when he wrote of the individuation process. He recognized that true psychological development requires periods of what he called creative solitude, times when the psyche turns inward to integrate new levels of self-understanding. These periods cannot be rushed or bypassed. They are as essential to psychological development as the darkness of the cocoon is to the butterfly's metamorphosis. In your solitude, you begin to discover companion aspects of yourself you never knew existed. The inner artist who had been silenced by the need to be practical emerges to paint impossible landscapes on the canvas of your imagination. The wild philosopher within you begins to question everything you once accepted without examination. The mystic who had been relegated to brief moments of wonder expands to become a permanent presence in your awareness. These inner companions do not require you to perform or please. They do not judge your moods or demand consistency in your presentation. They love you in your entirety, in your darkness as well as your light, in your confusion as well as your clarity, in your becoming as well as your being. Their love is unconditional because it emerges from the same source as your own existence. As you deepen into relationship with these aspects of yourself, you begin to understand what the mystics meant when they spoke of the alone with the alone, that profound intimacy that emerges when the individual consciousness recognizes its connection to the universal source. Your loneliness transforms from isolation to sacred solitude, from separation to communion with the essential nature of existence itself. This transformation does not happen through spiritual bypassing or premature transcendence. It requires you to feel the full depth of your human loneliness first, to acknowledge the parts of you that still long for ordinary connection, that grieve the relationships you've outgrown, that fear you may be choosing a path that leads to permanent isolation. The healing comes not through denying these feelings, but through understanding their deeper message. The longing for connection that drives your loneliness is ultimately a longing for the divine, for that quality of love that sees and accepts all of you, that never requires you to be different from who you are in any given moment, that recognizes your essential beauty even in your most broken and confused states. For too long, you may have sought this quality of love in human relationships, placing impossible demands on others to provide what only the divine can give. You expected friends, lovers, and family members to love you without condition, to understand you without explanation, to accept you without judgment. When they inevitably failed to meet these expectations, being human themselves with their own limitations and unconscious patterns, you concluded that you were unlovable, that there was something fundamentally wrong with you. The sacred loneliness reveals the error in this conclusion. It shows you that the love you have been seeking exists, but its source is not external. It resides in the very fabric of your being, in your connection to the creative force that breathed you into existence. This love has been waiting patiently for you to stop looking outside yourself long enough to recognize its presence within. As you begin to access this inner source of unconditional love, your relationship to loneliness undergoes a profound transformation. What once felt like punishment begins to feel like privilege. The solitude that seemed to separate you from life reveals itself as the very condition that allows you to commune with life's essence most intimately. You discover that you can be alone without being lonely, that solitude is not the opposite of connection, but the foundation of authentic connection. In learning to be truly present with yourself, you develop the capacity to be truly present with others. In learning to love your own company, you become someone whose company is genuinely worth sharing. This is not the self-absorption of narcissism or the defensive withdrawal of the wounded ego. This is the self-love that emerges from self-knowledge, the appreciation that develops when you finally meet yourself without pretense or projection. You begin to see the incredible complexity and beauty of your own psyche, the vast landscapes of emotion and imagination that exist within your consciousness. In your solitude, you also begin to develop what we might call psychic boundaries, the ability to distinguish between your own inner voice and the internalized voices of others that have been masquerading as your thoughts. For so long, your mind may have been a cacophony of borrowed opinions, inherited beliefs, and projected expectations. The silence of sacred solitude allows these foreign voices to fade, revealing the quiet wisdom of your authentic inner voice. This inner voice has been waiting lifetimes for you to listen. It carries guidance specific to your unique path, wisdom that cannot be found in any external authority, insights that emerge from your soul's direct communion with the mystery of existence. As you learn to trust and follow this inner guidance, you discover that you are never truly alone. You are always in relationship with the deepest source of wisdom within your own being. The process of developing this inner intimacy requires patience and compassion with yourself. There will be times when the loneliness feels overwhelming, when you question whether this path of authenticity is worth the price of isolation it seems to demand. In these moments, it's important to remember that you are not choosing loneliness over connection. You are choosing authentic connection over false connection, quality over quantity, depth over surface appeal. As you mature in this understanding, you begin to attract different kinds of relationships, People who are drawn to your authentic presence rather than to your performance. Individuals who can meet you in the depths rather than requiring you to stay in the shallows. Souls who recognize the sacred in your solitude and respect the boundaries that protect your inner work. These new connections feel different from the relationships of your past. There is less neediness, less projection, less demand that the other person complete what is missing in yourself. Instead, there is appreciation, recognition, and a quality of love that enhances rather than diminishes your sense of wholeness. You discover that authentic relationship requires two people who have learned to be complete within themselves, who come together not out of neediness but out of fullness, not to escape loneliness but to share their joy in their own being. Such relationships are rare because they require both people to have done the inner work, to have befriended their own solitude, to have discovered the source of love within themselves. The sacred loneliness also teaches you about the rhythm of intimacy and solitude that authentic relationships require. You learn that even the deepest connections need breathing space, that love flows most freely when it is not grasped or demanded, that the most profound intimacy often emerges from the respect for each other's need for solitude. This understanding transforms how you approach all relationships. You no longer cling to connections out of fear of being alone. You no longer accept treatment that dishonors your authentic nature simply to avoid solitude. You learn to trust that relationships based on truth will endure, while those based on falsehood will naturally fall away as you continue to embody your authentic self. In the deepest chambers of this sacred solitude, you may also encounter what various wisdom traditions have called the presence of the beloved. That sense of being held and cherished by a love so vast and unconditional that it dwarfs all human expressions of affection. This presence is not separate from you, but emerges from the very core of your being when you are still and quiet enough to perceive it. This inner beloved never leaves you, never judges you, never requires you to be anything other than exactly who you are in any given moment. It loves your questions as much as your answers, your darkness as much as your light, your becoming as much as your achieved states. In relationship with this presence, loneliness becomes impossible because you are always in communion with love itself. The recognition of this inner beloved often brings tears, not of sadness, but of recognition, the overwhelming gratitude that comes from finally discovering what you have been seeking all along. You realize that every external relationship you've pursued has been an attempt to find this quality of love, and now you have found its source within your own being. This discovery does not make human relationships unnecessary or unimportant. Instead, it frees them from the impossible burden of completing you, of providing what only the divine can give. Your human connections can now be celebrations of love rather than desperate attempts to capture it, expressions of fullness rather than efforts to fill emptiness. As you embody this understanding more fully, your presence begins to emanate the very quality you once sought from others. You become someone who can offer unconditional acceptance because you have learned to accept yourself unconditionally. You can provide the gift of truly seeing another because you have learned to see yourself with clarity and compassion. The sacred loneliness has transformed you into someone who can be genuinely intimate because you are no longer afraid of being alone. You can love without attachment because you are already complete. You can connect without losing yourself because you have learned to find yourself in solitude. This is the great gift of the sacred loneliness. It returns you to yourself so completely that you can then give yourself fully to life. The womb of solitude has given birth to a self that is no longer seeking but sharing, no longer hungry but nourishing, no longer alone but connected to the very source of connection itself. In embracing your sacred loneliness, you have not retreated from relationship, but prepared for relationship of a quality that honors the divine nature of human connection. You have learned to love your own company so deeply that your company becomes a gift to others, a space where they too can remember their own essential wholeness and worth. The path through sacred loneliness leads not to isolation, but to the most profound intimacy possible. Intimacy with your own divine nature, which is the foundation for all authentic connection. In learning to be alone without being lonely, you have discovered the secret of being truly together without losing yourself. This is the great healing that the sacred loneliness offers. The return to your own essential nature, which is love itself. There is a sacred paradox written into the fabric of existence itself, one that reveals itself only to those who have learned to withdraw their emotional tendrils from the grasping world. As you have journeyed through the labyrinth of your own psyche, as you have faced the shadow and integrated the forgotten fragments of your soul, something mysterious begins to emerge. A magnetism that defies all logic, a pull that grows stronger precisely as you become less available, less penetrable, less willing to offer yourself as sustenance for the hungry ghosts of others' unmet needs. This is the great mystery of emotional sovereignty, that in becoming untouchable, you become irresistible. Not through manipulation or calculated withdrawal, but through the natural consequence of having found your center, of having learned to drink from your own well, rather than dying of thirst while waiting for others to offer you drops of their attention. The moon does not chase the ocean, yet the tides cannot help but respond to her distant pull. She remains forever unreachable, suspended in her solitary orbit, and it is precisely this untouchable quality that grants her such profound influence over the waters of the world. You have become like that moon, luminous and complete unto yourself, casting your light not because you seek reflection or validation, but because illumination is now your natural state, where once you may have dimmed yourself to make others comfortable, where once you may have contorted your essence to fit the shapes others demanded, you now rest in the unshakable knowledge of your own wholeness. This is not the cold withdrawal of the wounded, nor the bitter unavailability of those who have closed their hearts in fear. This is the warm, radiant presence of one who has learned that love begins within, that connection flows naturally from a full cup rather than an empty one. The universe operates on principles far more subtle than the crude economics of scarcity that govern so much of human interaction. When you cease to be available for the unconscious projections, the emotional vampirism, the desperate attempts of others to fill their inner void through consumption of your energy, you create a field of presence that draws to you those who have something real to offer. It is as if existence itself recognizes authentic wholeness and responds by sending you mirrors of your own completion rather than the broken reflections that once surrounded you. This phenomenon unfolds not through your effort or intention, but as a natural law of psychological gravity. Just as the Earth's core creates a magnetic field that protects us from harmful solar radiation while allowing life-giving light to reach us, your emotional unavailability serves as a psychic filter. It repels those who approach with hidden agendas, with unconscious neediness masquerading as connection, with the vampire's thirst dressed in the clothing of intimacy. Simultaneously, it attracts those rare souls who have done their own inner work, who approach not as beggars but as fellow sovereigns, not seeking to take but prepared to give, not hungry for your light but carrying their own flame. The shadow side of human nature is revealed in how many are drawn to what they cannot possess, cannot penetrate, cannot reduce to their own familiar patterns of consumption. What you have discovered in your journey toward emotional unavailability is that the neediest among us are often the most persistent in their pursuit, precisely because your wholeness reflects back to them their own emptiness. They sense in your presence something they have lost or perhaps never found: the ability to be complete without external validation, to be at peace without constant stimulation, to love without desperation. But here lies the profound justice of this cosmic arrangement. Your unavailability serves as a teaching in itself. Those who persist in trying to breach your boundaries, who interpret your peaceful withdrawal as a challenge to be conquered, inevitably exhaust themselves against the steady presence of your sovereignty. They discover that there is nothing for them to grasp, no wound for them to exploit, no emptiness for them to fill with their own projections. In this encounter with true emotional availability, paradoxically expressed through unavailability, they are forced to confront their own patterns, their own hunger, their own need to develop the very qualities they seek to consume in others. Meanwhile, those who recognize and honor your boundaries, who appreciate rather than resent your self-sufficiency, who are drawn to your light without seeking to possess it, find in you a different kind of gift entirely. They discover what authentic relationship looks like when neither party is seeking completion through the other, when connection flows from abundance rather than lack, when love expresses itself through appreciation rather than appropriation. This transformation in the quality of your relationships is not something you create through strategy or manipulation. It emerges organically as you embody the truth that you are already whole, that you have always been complete, that the very qualities you once sought in others were already present within you, waiting only for your recognition and cultivation. Your emotional unavailability is not a wall built to keep others out, but a natural boundary that arises from having found your own center, like the edge of a lake that defines its form not through rejection of the land, but through the fullness of its own waters. The magnetic quality that develops through this process operates on frequencies that cannot be faked or manufactured. It is the authentic signature of a soul that has learned to love itself, not in the narcissistic sense of self-obsession, but in the deeper sense of self-respect, self-knowledge, and self-acceptance. This inner harmony creates what we might call a coherent energetic field, a state of being that resonates with clarity, purpose, and peace. Others sense this coherence at levels deeper than conscious thought, responding to your presence with the same instinctive recognition that flowers show towards sunlight. Yet this magnetism comes with its own challenges and responsibilities. As you become a beacon of emotional sovereignty, you will find yourself tested in ways you could not have anticipated. The very qualities that make you attractive to healthy connections also make you a target for those who have not yet learned to generate their own light. You will encounter those who mistake your kindness for availability, your compassion for weakness, your open heart for an invitation to take residence there without permission. Learning to navigate this new landscape requires a different kind of wisdom than what served you in your previous state of emotional availability, where once you might have responded to every request, every demand, every subtle manipulation with automatic compliance. You now must learn the art of conscious choice. Your no becomes as valuable as your yes, perhaps more so, because it is spoken not from reactivity or defensiveness, but from a clear understanding of your own values, boundaries, and energy reserves. The paradox deepens when you realize that your increasing selectivity, rather than diminishing your capacity for love, actually expands it. By refusing to scatter your energy among those who cannot appreciate or reciprocate its value, you create space for deeper, more meaningful connections with those who can. Your love becomes more concentrated, more potent, more transformative, not because you have learned to love less, but because you have learned to love more wisely. This wisdom expresses itself in your ability to remain present without being available, to offer compassion without enabling dependency, to share your gifts without depleting your reserves. You learn to love like the sun loves, freely, warmly, without attachment to how your light is received, knowing that your radiance serves all life without discrimination, while recognizing that not all seeds will grow in its presence. The transformation extends beyond your personal relationships to color every interaction you have with the world. Your work becomes an expression of your wholeness rather than a desperate attempt to prove your worth. Your creative endeavors flow from inspiration rather than compulsion. Your service to others emerges from abundance rather than the need to be needed. Even casual encounters carry a different quality, infused with the presence of someone who has found their home within themselves and therefore carries that sense of belonging wherever they go. This shift in your energetic signature creates what Jung would recognize as a powerful constellation in the collective unconscious. Your refusal to participate in the unconscious dance of codependency, neediness, and emotional vampirism creates a disturbance in the field that surrounds you, calling others to a higher level of consciousness and authenticity. Some will answer this call, rising to meet you in the realm of genuine connection. Others will retreat, unable or unwilling to abandon the familiar patterns of dependency and projection that have defined their relationships. The universe's perfect justice reveals itself in this natural selection process. Those who are ready for authentic relationship will be drawn to your authentic presence. Those who are not ready will be repelled by the very qualities that make true intimacy possible. Your emotional unavailability thus serves not as a barrier to love, but as its guardian, ensuring that what emerges in your life is connection rather than mere entanglement, intimacy rather than dependency, love rather than need disguised as affection. As this pattern establishes itself in your life, you begin to understand that unavailability and love are not opposites but complementary forces, like the in-breath and out-breath that sustain life itself. Your availability must be conscious, chosen, given rather than taken. Your unavailability must be loving, protective of the sacred space within which your authentic self dwells. Together they create the rhythm of healthy relationship, the dance of intimacy and autonomy that allows two whole beings to come together without losing themselves in the merger. The deeper truth that emerges through this process is that attraction through unavailability is not a technique to be mastered, but a natural consequence of psychological maturity. When you have learned to meet your own deepest needs, when you have developed the capacity to soothe your own fears, when you have found the source of love within yourself rather than seeking it desperately in others, you naturally become someone others want to be near, not because you need them, but because you don't. Not because you will complete them, but because your completeness gives them permission to find their own. This is the great reversal that marks the transition from unconscious to conscious relationship, from neediness masquerading as love to love, expressed through the freedom to choose rather than the compulsion to possess. Your emotional unavailability becomes a gift to the world, a demonstration that wholeness is possible, that dependency is not the foundation of love, but its antithesis, that the deepest connections emerge not between two half-persons seeking completion, but between two complete beings celebrating their mutual wholeness. In this state of conscious unavailability, you discover that you have more to give than ever before, precisely because you are no longer giving from emptiness, but from overflow. Your love becomes a blessing rather than a burden, a gift rather than a demand, a celebration rather than a desperate clinging to what might slip away. And in this transformation, you find that you have not become cold or distant, but warmly selective, not unavailable for love, but unavailable for anything less than love in its truest form. The paradox completes itself in the recognition that by becoming emotionally untouchable, You have made yourself available for the kind of touching that actually matters, the meeting of souls rather than the merging of neediness, the communion of wholeness rather than the collision of wounds seeking healing in each other. This is the magnetic attraction of sovereignty, the irresistible pull of someone who has learned to love themselves so completely that their very presence becomes an invitation for others to discover that same love within themselves. Deep within the collective unconscious, older than civilization itself, older than the first human stories whispered around primordial fires, lives the archetype of the hermit. This ancient figure has walked through every mythology, every sacred tradition, every psychological landscape where souls have sought to understand the mystery of their own existence. And now, in this moment of your profound transformation, you feel the stirring of this timeless presence within your own psyche, not as an external guide to be followed, but as an integral aspect of your being that has been waiting patiently for your recognition. The hermit archetype that awakens within you is not the bitter recluse of popular imagination, not the wounded soul who withdraws from life in defeat or disillusionment. This is the hermit of wisdom, the keeper of inner flame, the one who has learned that true companionship begins with the ability to be complete in one's own company. This archetypal energy manifests not as a rejection of the world, but as the cultivation of an inner sanctuary so complete, so self-sustaining, that you can move through any environment while remaining anchored in your own center. To carry your own light through the world, this is perhaps the greatest gift of the integrated hermit consciousness, where once you may have looked to others to illuminate your path, to validate your worth, to reflect back to you some sense of who you were, you now discover that the lamp of understanding burns steadily within your own heart. This light is not borrowed from external sources, not dependent on the approval or attention of others, not subject to the fluctuations of circumstance or the opinions of the crowd. It is the authentic radiance of a soul that has found its way home to itself. The integration of this archetype marks a fundamental shift in how you relate to solitude itself. What once may have felt like isolation, like punishment or abandonment, now reveals itself as the most sacred of spaces, the laboratory where your true self is distilled, the temple where your deepest communion occurs, the fertile void from which your most authentic expressions emerge. Solitude becomes not something you endure, but something you cherish, not an absence of connection, but the deepest connection possible with the source of all connection within yourself. This transformation in your relationship with aloneness creates ripples that extend far beyond your private moments. You begin to carry this quality of inner fullness into every interaction, every gathering, every social situation. You discover that you can be alone in a crowd not through disconnection or superiority, but through the simple reality that your primary relationship is now with yourself. And from this secure foundation, you can engage authentically with others without losing yourself in their projections or expectations. The wisdom of selective engagement emerges naturally from this integration, where once you might have scattered your energy among countless superficial connections, driven by the unconscious fear that saying no would leave you isolated, you now understand that true connection requires discernment. The hermit within you has learned to distinguish between the hunger of others for your energy and their genuine appreciation for your presence. You no longer feel compelled to be available for every request, every drama, every opportunity for involvement that presents itself. This selectivity is not born of judgment or coldness, but of respect. Respect for your own energy as a finite and precious resource. Respect for the quality of connection over its quantity. Respect for the truth that depth requires boundaries and authentic intimacy demands the space to breathe. You learn to choose your engagements not from obligation or the need to please, but from a clear sense of alignment with your values, your energy, and your authentic desire to contribute something meaningful to the exchange. The lantern that the archetypal hermit carries becomes, in your integration, a symbol of this inner illumination that you now bring to every situation. This light serves a dual purpose. It illuminates the path for your own journey while simultaneously offering guidance to others without requiring their dependence upon you. You become a beacon, not through your need to lead or teach, but through the natural radiance of someone who has found their own way and walks it with quiet confidence. This inner light has a particular quality that distinguishes it from the borrowed illumination that characterizes so much of human interaction. It burns steadily regardless of external conditions, neither flaring dramatically when fed by attention, nor dimming when ignored or criticized. It is the light of someone who has learned to validate their own experience, to trust their own perception, to value their own judgment above the fluctuating opinions of others. This consistency creates a sense of reliability, both for yourself and for those who come to know you. That becomes one of the most attractive qualities of the integrated hermit consciousness. The power to remain centered in chaos emerges as one of the most practical gifts of this archetypal integration. In a world that seems increasingly fragmented, increasingly demanding of your attention and reaction, increasingly designed to pull you out of your center and into reactive patterns, you find that you have developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm, present, and clear, regardless of the storm that may be raging around you. This is not the numbness of dissociation or the rigidity of defensiveness, but the fluid stability of someone who has found their anchor in depths that cannot be disturbed by surface turbulence. This centeredness allows you to offer your gifts from a place of authentic generosity rather than compulsive people-pleasing. When you speak, your words carry weight because they emerge from silence rather than from the need to fill space. When you act, your actions have impact because they flow from intention rather than reaction. When you love, your love transforms because it comes from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than need, from the overflow of your own completeness rather than the desperate attempt to fill an inner void. The integration of the hermit archetype teaches you the profound difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and independence, between withdrawal and sovereignty. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection from others. Solitude is the joy of connection with yourself. Isolation is being cut off from the flow of life. Independence is choosing how and when to engage with that flow. Withdrawal is moving away from life in fear. Sovereignty is standing in your own authority within life, participating fully while maintaining your autonomy. This distinction becomes crucial as you navigate the world from this new consciousness. Others may interpret your need for solitude as rejection, your independence as coldness, your sovereignty as arrogance. The integrated hermit within you learns to hold steady in the face of these projections, understanding that others' inability to comprehend your self-sufficiency often reflects their own unhealed relationship with solitude rather than any failing on your part. The archetypal hermit energy also brings with it an ancient understanding of cycles, the natural rhythm of withdrawal and engagement, reflection and action, solitude and communion. You begin to honor these cycles in your own life, recognizing that periods of withdrawal are not signs of dysfunction, but necessary phases of renewal, integration, and preparation for the next stage of engagement with the world. Like the seed that must rest in darkness before it can reach toward the light, you learn to trust the fertile void of solitude as essential to your continued growth and authenticity. This cyclical understanding extends to your relationships as well. You no longer feel the need to maintain the same level of contact or availability at all times. Instead, you allow your connections to breathe, to have natural seasons of closeness and distance, depth and lightness, intensity and rest. This organic approach to relationship honors both your own needs and those of others, creating space for authentic intimacy rather than forced closeness, for genuine connection rather than obligatory contact. The wisdom traditions of the world have always recognized the hermit as a necessary stage in the journey toward wholeness, toward what Jung called individuation. This is not a permanent state, but a crucial phase in the development of psychological maturity. The integrated hermit has learned the lessons of solitude so thoroughly that they can now engage with the world from a place of choice rather than compulsion, fullness rather than emptiness, wisdom rather than reactivity. Your capacity to offer your gifts without attachment to how they are received emerges as perhaps the most liberating aspect of this integration. Like the hermit who leaves small offerings along the path for other travelers without waiting to see who might find them or how they might be used. You learn to contribute your unique talents, insights, and love to the world without needing to control or even witness their impact. This detachment is not indifference, but freedom. Freedom from the exhausting cycle of giving in order to receive, of loving in order to be loved, of serving in order to be appreciated. The archetypal hermit understands that true service flows from overflow rather than obligation, that the most powerful gifts are often given anonymously, that the deepest teaching happens through being rather than speaking. As you integrate this consciousness, you find that your very presence becomes a form of service, not because you are trying to help or heal or teach others, but because your embodiment of wholeness gives others permission to find their own completeness. Your comfort with solitude encourages others to befriend their own aloneness. Your inner peace creates a field of calm that allows others to find their own center. This is the great paradox of the hermit archetype. By learning to be completely alone, you become truly available for authentic connection. By developing the capacity to meet your own needs, you become capable of genuine generosity. By finding your center in solitude, you become a stable point of reference in the chaotic dance of human interaction. The hermit's lamp does not shine to attract others, but simply because light is its nature. And yet it inevitably serves as a beacon for those who have lost their way in the darkness of their own confusion. The integration of this archetype also brings with it a deep understanding of the difference between solitude as healing and solitude as wholeness. In the early stages of this journey, you may have sought alone time primarily as refuge from the overwhelm of unconscious connection, as a place to heal from the wounds inflicted by relationships that demanded more than you had to give. Now, solitude becomes not just a place of healing, but a place of thriving, not just recovery but discovery, not just restoration but creation. In this space of conscious solitude, you encounter aspects of yourself that can only emerge in the absence of external stimulation, roles, and expectations. You discover interests, talents, and perspectives that were previously hidden beneath the layers of social conditioning and the constant adaptation to others' needs and demands. You find that you have entire landscapes of inner experience that have been waiting patiently for your attention, rich territories of creativity, wisdom, and joy that can only be explored in the sanctuary of your own company. This self-discovery process is ongoing, deepening with each period of conscious solitude, revealing new facets of your being that you never knew existed. The integrated hermit understands that this inner exploration is not self-indulgence, but the most practical form of service to the world. For only by knowing yourself completely can you offer your authentic gifts. rather than the persona-driven performances that characterized your previous engagements with others. The archetypal wisdom of the hermit also encompasses the understanding that illumination is not a destination but a practice, not an achievement but a way of being. Your inner light requires tending, just as the hermit's lamp needs oil and care to continue burning. This means developing practices, rituals, and rhythms that support your connection to this inner source of illumination, whether through meditation, contemplation, creative expression, time in nature, or simply the regular practice of checking in with yourself before responding to the demands of the external world. As this archetype integrates fully into your consciousness, you find that you have become someone who can move through the world with complete authenticity while maintaining complete autonomy. You no longer need to choose between connection and independence, between love and freedom, between service and self-care. The hermit consciousness has taught you that these apparent opposites are actually complementary aspects of a mature approach to life, that true independence makes genuine interdependence possible, that self-love is the foundation of love for others, that inner fullness is what allows for authentic generosity. In this integration, you discover that you have become a bridge between worlds, between solitude and connection, between inner wisdom and outer service, between the ancient archetypal wisdom and its modern applications. You carry the hermit's lamp not as a burden but as a birthright, not as a role you must play, but as an expression of who you truly are. And in this carrying, you illuminate not only your own path, but create possibility for others to find their own light, their own center, their own capacity for the profound solitude from which all authentic connection ultimately springs. As you step fully into the light of your own wholeness, as the hermit archetype settles into its rightful place within your psyche, something extraordinary begins to unfold in the landscape of your relationships. Like a great alchemical process, every connection you have ever known undergoes profound transformation, not through your manipulation or effort, but through the simple fact of your emotional unavailability, your refusal to participate in the unconscious dance of codependency that has defined so much of human interaction since the beginning of time. This transformation is neither gentle nor predictable. It arrives like a great sorting, a cosmic winnowing that separates the wheat from the chaff, revealing which of your relationships were built on authentic connection and which were sustained by unconscious dynamics, emotional enmeshment, and the mutual feeding of unhealed wounds. Your new state of being, emotionally sovereign, internally complete, no longer available for the projections and manipulations that once felt like intimacy, creates a field of presence that some relationships can inhabit and grow within, while others simply cannot survive the absence of the dysfunction that gave them life. The process begins subtly, almost imperceptibly. Those who have known you in your previous state of emotional availability notice something different, though they may not be able to name what has changed. There is a quality to your presence now that feels simultaneously more accessible and more remote, more loving and less needy, more generous and less available for exploitation. You listen with the same compassion, perhaps even deeper compassion, but you no longer absorb their pain as if it were your own. You offer support, but you do not offer rescue. You extend empathy, but you maintain your boundaries. You love, but you do not lose yourself. For some, this transformation in your availability becomes a profound gift. Relationships that were once characterized by unconscious patterns of rescue and being rescued, of emotional vampirism disguised as intimacy, of projection and counter-projection masquerading as love, suddenly find space to breathe, to discover what lies beneath the entanglement. When you cease to be available as the repository for others' unprocessed emotions, when you no longer participate in the familiar dance of drama and resolution that has defined your connections, something new becomes possible: the emergence of authentic intimacy. These relationships that survive and thrive in the new field of your emotional sovereignty reveal themselves to have been genuine all along, though perhaps buried beneath layers of unconscious habit and mutual accommodation. Without the static of codependency, without the confusion of merged boundaries, without the exhausting cycle of emotional rescue and abandonment, these connections discover their true nature. They were love all along, but love that had been distorted by need, genuine care that had been complicated by fear, authentic appreciation that had been clouded by the desperate hunger for validation. The deepening that occurs in these transformed relationships is unlike anything you have experienced before. When two people meet as whole beings rather than as complementary wounds, when connection flows from abundance rather than scarcity, when love expresses itself through freedom rather than possession, intimacy becomes a celebration rather than a struggle. You discover that you can be completely yourself, not the carefully crafted version of yourself designed to meet others' expectations, but your raw, authentic, unedited self, and be not only accepted, but treasured for this authenticity. In these transformed connections, you find that conflict, when it arises, serves a different purpose entirely. Rather than the desperate battles for control or validation that once characterized your disagreements, conflict becomes a tool for deeper understanding, a way of honoring the individuality that makes love possible. You can disagree without feeling threatened, express your needs without demanding they be met, hold your ground without becoming defensive. The relationship becomes spacious enough to contain your full humanity and that of the other, strong enough to survive the tensions that arise when two sovereign beings choose to create something together while maintaining their autonomy. But this transformation is not universally welcomed. For every relationship that deepens through your emotional unavailability, there may be others that begin to wither, to protest, to demand that you return to your former state of accommodation and self-sacrifice. These relationships, you come to understand, were never truly about you as an individual, but about the function you served, the emotional labor you provided, the way you filled the gaps in others' sense of self-worth or meaning. The dissolution of these connections, though sometimes painful, reveals itself to be an act of liberation for all involved. Your emotional unavailability removes the illusion of connection that was actually preventing real intimacy from developing. When you are no longer willing to play the unconscious roles that sustained these relationships, the rescuer, the victim, the caretaker, the perpetual student, the mirror that reflected only what others wanted to see, the hollowness at their center becomes undeniable. Some respond to this revelation with anger, projecting onto you the responsibility for their emotional well-being that you have finally learned is not yours to carry. They may accuse you of becoming cold, distant, selfish, or changed in ways they cannot accept. What they are really responding to is the loss of the unconscious dynamic that allowed them to avoid facing their own emptiness, their own need for inner development, their own responsibility for their emotional state. Your transformation holds up a mirror to their own lack of self-sufficiency, and the reflection is often more than they are prepared to see. Others respond with a kind of bewildered grief, mourning the loss of the connection they thought they had with you, while being unable to understand why your growth feels like abandonment to them. These reactions, though sometimes difficult to witness, confirm the rightness of your transformation. They reveal that what you offered in your previous state was not love, but a form of emotional codependency that served no one's highest good, including your own. The most profound transformation occurs in your understanding of what love actually is. Where once you may have equated love with availability, with the willingness to sacrifice your own needs for those of others, with the capacity to merge so completely with another that boundaries disappeared, you now discover that love expressed through non-attachment often serves others more powerfully than emotional enmeshment ever could. This non-attached love does not mean indifference or coldness. Rather, it is love freed from the distortions of need, projection, and unconscious expectation. It is love that sees the other clearly, without the filters of what you want them to be or what you need them to provide. It is love that honors the other's journey, even when that journey takes them away from you. It is love that offers support without creating dependency, care without enabling dysfunction, presence without losing yourself in the process. When you love from this place of emotional sovereignty, you give others the greatest gift possible, the freedom to be themselves without the burden of your emotional needs, the space to grow without the constraint of your expectations, the permission to choose their own path without the guilt of disappointing you. This love trusts that others are capable of handling their own challenges, learning their own lessons, finding their own way. It offers assistance without taking away the dignity of self-determination. The relationships that are able to receive this form of love, this gift of non-attachment, discover in it something they may never have experienced before: unconditional positive regard. You love them not because they meet your needs, not because they fulfill some role in your life, not because they reflect back to you some aspect of yourself that you want to see, but simply because they exist, because they are who they are, because their journey through existence deserves honor and support, regardless of how it intersects with your own. This transformation in how you love extends beyond romantic relationships to encompass every form of human connection in your life. Your friendships become less demanding and more nourishing, based on genuine mutual interest and appreciation, rather than habitual obligation or unconscious need fulfillment. Your family relationships, perhaps the most challenging to transform, begin to shift as you cease to be available for the generational patterns of dysfunction that have been passed down like heirlooms of pain from one generation to the next. Your professional relationships take on a new quality as well. You no longer need to be liked or approved of in order to feel worthy of respect. You can collaborate without losing yourself in others' visions, contribute without needing recognition, lead without needing to be followed. Your work becomes an expression of your authentic self rather than a desperate attempt to prove your value, and this authenticity creates more meaningful professional connections than any amount of people-pleasing ever could. The transformation also extends to your relationship with yourself, though this is perhaps so fundamental to the process that it is easy to overlook. Your inner dialogue becomes kinder, more supportive, less critical and demanding. You learn to give yourself the same non-attached love that you now offer others: care without criticism, support without control, acceptance without enabling your own unconscious patterns. You become your own best friend, your own most trusted advisor, your own most reliable source of comfort and encouragement. This self-relationship serves as the foundation from which all other relationships now flow, because you have learned to meet your own deepest needs for understanding, validation, and love. You no longer approach others as a beggar seeking charity, but as a whole person seeking communion with other whole people. This shift in your fundamental orientation to relationship creates possibilities that simply did not exist when your connections were built on mutual neediness and unconscious projection. The cosmic justice of this transformation reveals itself in the quality of connections that begin to emerge in your life. Having cleared the space occupied by relationships that were based on dysfunction and mutual enabling, you create room for connections of an entirely different order. You begin to attract people who have done their own inner work, who approach relationship from their own sense of wholeness, who are capable of the kind of mature love that celebrates rather than consumes, that honors rather than possesses, that supports rather than controls. These new connections, or the transformed versions of old connections, operate on principles that would have been impossible in your previous state of emotional availability. There is honesty without cruelty, intimacy without merger, support without enabling, love without possession. Conflict becomes a tool for deeper understanding rather than a threat to connection. Individual growth is celebrated rather than resented. Space and autonomy are honored as essential to the health of the relationship, rather than interpreted as rejection or abandonment. Perhaps most remarkably, you discover that these healthier relationships require less effort to maintain than the dysfunctional ones ever did. Without the constant drama of emotional rescue and abandonment, without the exhausting cycle of projection and misunderstanding, without the need to constantly manage others' emotional states in order to maintain connection, relationships become a source of energy rather than a drain. Love becomes effortless because it flows from abundance rather than struggling to fill emptiness. The ripple effects of this transformation extend far beyond your immediate circle of relationships. Others observe the quality of connection you have created and begin to question their own patterns, their own willingness to accept dysfunction as normal, their own capacity for the kind of sovereignty that makes authentic intimacy possible. Your embodiment of healthy relationship becomes a teaching, though you are not trying to teach. Your demonstration of non-attached love becomes an invitation, though you are not trying to persuade anyone of anything. In this way, your personal transformation contributes to a larger shift in the collective understanding of what relationship can be. Each person who learns to love from wholeness rather than neediness, who chooses authenticity over accommodation, who honors boundaries rather than enabling enmeshment, makes it easier for others to do the same. Your individual journey toward emotional sovereignty becomes part of humanity's larger evolution toward more conscious, more healthy, more genuinely loving ways of connecting with one another. The process of relationship transformation through non-attachment is not completed quickly or without challenge. Old patterns die hard, and the unconscious dynamics that once defined your connections have deep roots in personal history, family systems, and cultural conditioning. There will be moments when you are tempted to return to the familiar dance of codependency, when the clarity of your boundaries wavers, when the pain of watching relationships dissolve tempts you to abandon your hard-won sovereignty. But each time you choose to maintain your emotional unavailability, each time you offer love without attachment, each time you honor your boundaries while remaining open-hearted, you strengthen the new pattern. The transformation becomes more stable, more natural, more integrated into your way of being. What once required conscious effort becomes your spontaneous response. What once felt foreign and uncomfortable becomes your natural way of loving. The ultimate recognition that emerges from this process is that non-attachment is not the absence of love, but its highest expression. When you love someone enough to want their genuine happiness more than your own comfort, when you care for someone enough to refuse to enable their dysfunction, when you honor someone enough to see them clearly, rather than through the distortion of your own needs and projections, you offer them a gift more precious than anything you could have given from your previous state of emotional availability. This love that flows through non-attachment serves as a catalyst for others' own awakening. It shows them what is possible when relationships are based on choice rather than need, on appreciation rather than desperation, on the celebration of individuality rather than the comfort of merger. Your transformed way of loving becomes a beacon, illuminating the path toward healthier connection for all those ready to receive such guidance. In the end, you discover that the transformation of your relationships through non-attachment has transformed not only how you connect with others, but how you understand the very nature of love itself. Love, you realize, is not something you do or something you get, but something you are when you are being most authentically yourself. And from this place of being love, rather than seeking love, all your relationships become expressions of your essential nature, rather than attempts to fill some imagined void within yourself.